Well, good afternoon. Welcome to Finding a Way Forward, Vaccine Mandates and Religious Liberty. I'm Steve Allred, the Religious Liberty Liaison for the Northern California Conference, and thank you for spending part of your afternoon with us. I think you'll find that this will be time well spent, and I know that you're going to enjoy our panel that we have planned for you today. So today we're going to be talking about something that is controversial. And I should say very relevant as well. We're going to talk about vaccines, vaccine mandates, and how those relate to religious liberty. We will no doubt have a spectrum of viewpoints on this topic today. A big underlying goal here that I have, and I believe my panelists share this goal as well, is to find a way forward for us as believers, people who believe in Jesus, in his word. And after all, we are Christians who follow the Bible. And I think of Paul's admonition in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 3. It's one that's spoken to me over the last year when things, we have a lot of division, it seems like, in society and in the church. And Ephesians 4:3 says that we are called to make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. Well, that's what we want to do. We want to make an effort, every effort, Paul says, to do that. Now, here's the thing. I'm sure that just like me, you probably have an opinion about these topics that we'll be discussing today. Maybe your opinion is a very strong opinion, and you may have good reason for what you believe, and that's okay. But the tendency for all of us, I think, is to retreat into our own echo chambers, where we can talk with and listen to people that think like us, that believe like us. We tend to do this with our news. We tend to do this with our news sources, our social media, our circle of friends, even the churches we choose. Oftentimes, we want to find people that agree with us on all of these things. And to an extent, some of that's unavoidable. It's just going to happen, and maybe it's even good in some ways, but it can also have, I believe, a detrimental effect on our society and our church, leading us to become ever more polarized and divided. And while that may be the natural tendency in how the world operates, we're followers of Christ. And I think we ought to be different in some ways in regard to this. I think we ought to be willing to dialogue with people we disagree with respectfully. Yes, we can argue, but we can do it in a good spirit. And we can share evidence. We can grapple with things. And maybe we won't resolve the issue. I'm not naive enough to think that we're going to all convince each other. But hopefully we can still love one another and be friends and learn from each other along the way. And that's our goal here today. I've invited a panel of experts. I'm really excited about this group of people. These folks are the best in their fields. There are a variety of opinions represented on this panel on what will be discussed today. I think the majority of the panelists would support the general position of the Adventist Church in North America on the whole vaccine issue. And I think that's appropriate, given that this is a church-sponsored program. But this is by no means a homogenous group when it comes to opinions. I've listened to programs that some of these folks have been involved with, and I've learned from them things I've, may not have agreed with before. Maybe I've learned some things. And so we want to include voices from different perspectives here today. Now, I've shared some discussion topics with the panelists, some questions I'm probably going to ask them if we have the time to get through all these. And I don't know exactly what they're going to say. I haven't, pre-screened them to see exactly what they're going to say. I'm looking forward to hearing from them, and we're going to see where this conversation goes. I really believe it's going to be in a good spirit, though, and that God's going to lead it. So without further ado, let's get started with a prayer. I'm going to invite Dr. Marc Woodson to join us here. There he is. Good afternoon, Dr. Woodson.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay?
You're a little, let me turn my volume up here. Maybe that's my problem. There we go. It's good to see you. And let me just introduce you for our audience. Of course, our local conference audience here knows you very well because you are the president of the Adventist Church in the Northern California area here that we call the Northern California Conference. And you have been doing this for exactly how long?
3 years and 2 days.
3 years. Wow. Down to a day. And before that, of course, you were no stranger. You were here as our executive secretary. And then, you have been in California working in different conferences, for many years throughout your career. So we are just very thankful to have you on the panel today, because I think your voice is an important one as we talk about something as important as this. And it's controversial too. So I really appreciate you being here. Would you be willing, I'm going to ask you a question in just a minute, and I want to hear your response, but would you be willing to first of all start us out with a prayer?
Oh, sure, be glad to.
Okay, let's do that.
Let's pray together. Father, we're grateful to have this time for dialogue and among Christian brothers and sisters. And Father, what's most important is we want to please you and do what is best on behalf of your kingdom and on behalf of your glory. So we ask for your wisdom today. We pray that you will shed light and that our hearts will be open to this conversation today. So we need your Holy Spirit. Thank you for this opportunity to dialogue with one another. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen. Thank you. Oh, by the way, before we introduce our panelists, I'm going to ask if we could put up an event that's happening here in December. Thank you, Dr. Woodson, for that. We're going to show on the screen, though, an event that we are doing just to plug it here at the very beginning. Lori, if you could throw up that slide for this is an event we have coming up here in a couple of months. You might want to put that on your calendar. Another hot topic and one that you may want to join us for. So let's go ahead and start introducing our panelists. Let's start out here with, I'm going to do it by alphabetical order of first name, Dr. Eric Walsh. We're going to add him to the screen here. Welcome, Dr. Walsh. Dr. Walsh is joining us from Indianapolis today. That's not where you live, but that's where you are right now. So we'll keep in mind it's a little later for you out there. We won't go too long. But thanks for being here. Let me just say, I got this bio here for Dr. Walsh to introduce him a little bit. He's an expert in public health with multiple advanced degrees. He's served as a public health department director, and as well as been on the President Obama's Presidential Advisory Council on HIV/AIDS. And he's also served as an associate pastor for his church. He is a medical doctor and has a doctorate in public health.
Let me be specific. I was an associate pastor as well for Dr. Woodson there. So
that is the. I don't think you include that in your bio anytime you do this.
I'm gonna add it now.
That might stop you from getting into a lot of places.
I'm glad I could facilitate a reunion here of
we are great
pastors.
Yes, that's my buddy there, man.
All right. Well, it's good to have you here, Dr. Walsh. Thank you for joining us. Next, I want to add Jonathan Cherney to the panel. Jonathan is a friend of mine, and he is, as I said, or I don't know if I said this yet, but he's an attorney. And he is, with his own legal practice, he's worked in the religious liberty trenches for 10 years, taking cases to trial and up on appeal. He is also the associate director of American Cassette Ministries and
American Christian Ministries. Now we got rid of the cassette.
I'm sorry, I misread that. American
That's
Christian
right.
Ministries, formerly American Cassette Ministries. Okay, my bad.
Cassettes are a little out of date, but we have a great app. So just encourage everyone to download our app, American Christian Ministries. Check it out.
Awesome, thank you. And Jonathan is joining us also from the East Coast. He's out in North Carolina, I think, right now, you said, right?
South Carolina.
South. Okay. See, I don't know where Hilton Head is. I know it's in one of the Carolinas, but so thank you for being here, Jonathan. It's good to have you. Looking forward to hearing from you today. Let me introduce Dr. Joyce Che. She is our one female panelist. I'm so sorry, Dr. Che. You're surrounded by a bunch of guys here today. Next time we'll get some more ladies involved. But thank you for being here. Dr. Che is a medical doctor, as well as has her master's in public health. She's a board certified ophthalmologist who's been in practice for almost 20 years. She has a deep interest in the Adventist health message and is co-founder of medmissionary.com, a ministry that was helped to educate formed to educate, encourage, and train Adventists for true medical missionary work. She has co-written the Autoimmune Plant-Based Cookbook, which can be purchased at wholenessmarket.com, and she can be reached at joyce@medmissionary.com. Thanks for being here with us, Dr. Che.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you
Happy
so
to be
much.
here.
All right, next is Dr. Nicholas Miller. We'll add him to the panel. Dr. Miller, thank you for being here. He's coming to us from Michigan and also a couple time zones ahead. All of you East Coast people, I appreciate this. Dr. Miller is professor of church history and the director of the International Religious Liberty Institute. He received a BA in theology from Pacific Union College, just up the road from us here. And so you've been in Northern California before. This is,
Certainly
this
have.
is why we have you back. Yep. And he also has a JD, a Juris Doctor from Columbia University Law School, where he was a Stone Scholar and an editor of the Columbia Law Review. He also has a PhD in American Religious and Legal History from the University of Notre Dame, where he received the award for the Best Dissertation of the Year for 2010 from the History Department. He's argued many cases in state and federal courts, appeared before the U.S. Supreme Court in the case of Mitchell v. Helms, and is the author of more than 30 scholarly and professional journal articles and book chapters dealing with issues of church, state, and society. His book on the development of religious freedom in America, The Religious Roots of the First Amendment, was published by Oxford University Press in the summer of 2012, and he edited the Andrews University book on homosexuality, marriage, and the church also in 2012. And so, Dr. Miller, we're really happy to have you here today as well.
Thank you.
And last but certainly not least is Dr. Roger Schwelt. And Dr. Schwelt is coming to us today from San Diego. He wishes he lived there, but he doesn't right now. But he's living there right now, right? And Dr. Schwelt is an associate clinical professor at the University of California, Riverside School of Medicine and an assistant clinical professor at the School of Medicine and Allied Health at Loma Linda University. Roger is quadruple board certified in internal medicine, pulmonary diseases, critical care medicine, and sleep medicine through the American Board of Internal Medicine. Roger's current practice is in Redlands, California with Beaver Medical Group, where he treats patients with COVID-19 in the ICU and also treats post-COVID patients in the outpatient clinic. He's also the co-founder of MedCram, an online medical education company. By the way, great videos if you haven't seen them. Dr. Schwelt is a member of the Loma Linda University Church in Loma Linda, California. His passion is demystifying medical concepts and studying the Bible. Welcome, Dr. Schwelt.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
So this is just great to have all of you here, and I just know that our time together is going to be good, simply because I've been able to kind of hear from all of you over the past few months in different forms, whether online or in other forms. And so I'm looking forward to what you have to say today. Now, I want to start out with Dr. Woodson and ask a question to kind of just set the groundwork for what we're going to be talking about today. Since the beginning of the pandemic, there has been much talk about loving your neighbor and doing what's best for society, right? Many Christians have supported public health measures that have been aimed at limiting the spread of COVID and, ostensibly saving lives. Things like social distancing, mask mandates, and now, of course, vaccinations, hot topic, right? At the same time, other Christians have expressed concern about the limitations on personal liberty that have been seen over the past year. And these Christians have argued that we should be concerned about focusing too much on the common good, noting that an overemphasis on this can lead to groupthink and loss of personal liberty. And so I think both sides, at least that I've talked to, would agree that loving your neighbor is important. No contest or no argument there. And I think both sides would agree that personal freedom ought to be cherished. So the question is, how do followers of Christ navigate situations like this? Let me throw this verse up on the screen, Matthew 7, verse 12, just as a reminder to us as we start out today. Jesus told us that loving our neighbor is paramount. He said, in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. So, Dr. Woodson, how should Christians know when to go along with what is thought to be best for society Government, public health agencies are telling us this is what's best, you should do this, and when to go against the flow and be different?
Oh, well, thanks. Well, first of all, I have to say that my father-in-law always reminds me of this, that I'm a doctor of ministry and not a medical doctor. So he says I'm not a real doctor, so that's good. But I would say this. So we do need to follow, in my mind, I think whatever a Christian, and you've kind of led up to this, Steve, really well, when you said that as followers of Christ, that needs to be the standard by which we make decisions and how we relate to society. The scriptures are very full, especially in the New Testament, how we are to live in a society that is not a theocracy, right? Because you've got a lot in the Old Testament where there's a theocracy where God is leading the people of Israel and so forth. But in the New Testament, of course, we've got God's people, been a new church, a new sect, followers of this Messiah, who are now living in a society that's not controlled, so to speak, by God. So how do we live in that environment? First thing that makes me think of is when you said to be different. I don't think we need to be different just for difference sake. That's the first thing. I think there's a lot of times we say, well, we've got to be different. Well, it's not about being different for being different's sake. The difference needs to show up in the principles that God gives for his kingdom. So to me, that principle is obviously the principle of love. It is the principle of love, which is why we get the whole concept of loving our neighbor. Well, that came from Christ's words when he's answering an attorney, by the way. And he's saying, what is the greatest commandment in the law? What is that? And it's Jesus who then says to him in response, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. And of course, then he says, this is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments, All the law and the prophets hang on those. So I was visiting a church last week and they had two banners on there, and to me, it captured it. And it just said, love God and love people. And it was based upon Matthew chapter 22. And to me, that's the principle that we live by, is love God with all your heart, but I'm to love my neighbor as I love myself. That's the principle of love. So I want to do, and you spoke already about the golden rule, right? Do unto others you have them do unto you. So I want to do everything that I can possibly that shows love to my neighbor as I love myself, and is a representative of who God is. So that needs to be the standard by which I judge every action as it relates to society, that I don't do anything that's going to hurt my brother or my sister. And I am going to do everything that brings honor and glory to God. And so, yeah, there are going to be those times where and we see them all the time, where I have to make a decision that may go against the flow because it goes against what God would have us do based upon his principles. But there are some things that are helpful to society that don't go against God's principles. And so it's okay. If that's what we're considering the flow to be, then that's okay. Not only should we, it's not even a matter of going against the flow or with the flow. Jesus calls us to be not just passive individuals in society. He calls us to be even more than that when he says, you are to be both light and you're to be salt. And so the light is the idea of understanding and to get people to understand. But salt is a different concept. And it's not, a lot of times we think, oh, that's just about flavor. Salt is also, in that time that Jesus was speaking, was about preserving. So Jesus doesn't just say, go, you're there in society. He says we have to engage the world, and that's making a difference in the world. Our actions are to make a difference in the world that we are to live in.
So you, I think, make a distinction there. If what the world is asking us to do, if in a case of, a situation here with public health emergency, goes against what God has asked us to do, then obviously we shouldn't do that. And I think for those who are opposed to the vaccines and things of that nature, that's what they see happening, of course, is they believe that this is actually, going against what God wants them to do. And we'll get into that more in a little bit. But I think we'd all agree with what you're saying here, is that God does want us to love our neighbor. It is the second commandment. It is the greatest commandment. And it seems like, and let me just, I know we probably have some other panelists. Let me, Lori, can we throw up that quotation, the Great Web of Humanity quote here? Let me throw that up on the screen. I'm not sure if I can do that here, but listen to this here from Ellen White, Patriarchs and Prophets. I think it's a very interesting quote. She says, "We are all woven together in the great web of humanity." That's an interesting picture, isn't it? And whatever we can do to benefit and uplift others will reflect in blessing upon ourselves. The law of mutual dependence runs through all classes of society. Let's bring all the panelists back on. I'd like to hear any follow-up thoughts from anybody else on any of this. But
can I just add one more thing real quick?
Yes, please.
I had this conversation with one of my neighbors just 2 days ago.
Mm-hmm.
And he was saying why he really didn't. He was asking me actually why I was vaccinated. Was I concerned about it? And we had a nice conversation. And he's not a Christian. He's not an Adventist Christian. But one of the things that I explained to him on why I was vaccinated, also why I wear a mask, even I'm vaccinated in certain places, I said, because we're part of a community, we're part of a society, and I want to do everything else. I want to do everything in my power to be protective of those who are in that community and are in that society. And I think that's the point of it for me as a Christian.
I like that. Any other thoughts?
This is Jonathan here. I have I've heard a lot of, talked to a lot of different people with different opinions. The one thing I did learn in law school is that, there's always two sides to every argument, right? And, but it's interesting that verse, love your neighbor as yourself. Some people have told me, hey, I'm getting vaccinated because, I'm loving my neighbor as myself. That's something I would do and I would want to do. But then the other side, other people have said, hey, I'm not getting vaccinated because I love my neighbor as myself. I think the vaccines are harmful and I wouldn't want, my neighbor to get harmed. Maybe there's talk about shedding or different things, or, it's harmful to me. And so it really, a lot of it depends upon, kind of your frame of thinking. And so whether you think this is a loving act or not, you could be on both sides of the aisle and still think you're acting out of love because you're doing, what you would want done to you and what you think is best for other people. And so it's, I think that's something that we need to understand is it's not that somebody with the other view doesn't have a view of love for you because they're not doing what you're doing, but they're doing it because they do love you. And so, I think just, we as Christians and Adventists, in order to, not polarize the church, is to understand that, a lot of people are making the choices they are making, whether it's, on this side or that side, is out of love because they think that is the loving thing to do, whether it's right or wrong.
Yeah, no, I think this really goes to assigning motives to people, and we need to be careful not to do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's an excellent point, Jonathan, and I think we need to remember that no matter which perspective. And so we're going to get into some of the nitty gritty here today. I want to kind of move on to ask Dr. Schwelt a question here because we have a lot of questions to get through, and we don't want to be here till now. Okay? I'm seeing Dr. Schwelt there, and I'm just making sure that he's coming through here. So let me ask this to you, Dr. Schwelt. In the context of a pandemic, how do Christians have an informed perspective on what is best for society? Okay, because this is really the issue. We all want to love our neighbor. We all want to figure out how to do that, but there's big disagreement on what that looks like, right? Also, I think all of us regardless of our perspective, would agree that our society, and by extension the church, is suffering from an epidemic of mis and disinformation. How do we find credible sources and know what is true out there so we can know what is best for society and for each other?
It's an excellent point. And, the question of who do we turn to for genuine medical or otherwise information, it's hard enough before it became politicized. And so where do you turn? I would say that the places that you turn to is, first of all, look to the Bible and look to the spirit of prophecy in terms of what is truth, and see if you can find similar situations that have happened in the past where they have been dealt with. I think that's very important. But also become knowledgeable of people who are in the field. My taxes have gotten a lot more complicated since I was in college. I don't do my taxes anymore. I take them to tax specialists because the tax code has become so large that you want to make sure you have an expert who's dealing with it to make sure you do it right. The other thing I often tell people is be suspicious of claims that are just, very sensationalized. I can tell you that as a practicing clinician, we use antibiotics for bacterial infections. And I can tell you that people come in all the time with bacterial infections, and we never see a 90% success rate, 80% success rate. The human body is so complex. People are so far gone that even with antibiotics and bacterial infections, we don't see 90%. So if someone tells you that this one medication is going to completely eliminate the need for hospitalization for any disease, I would be very skeptical of that case. And for those who are in the medical field, they know that is the case. I mean, it's very rare that you would see anything like that. Look for track records. Look for people who have been in the industry, who've done things. I know there's a lot of misinformation going around. People, saying doctors get paid from vaccine companies. That doctors are getting paid to put incorrect death causes on death certificates. That's obviously not the case if you're anywhere familiar with the medical industry and how it works. For instance, us at MedCram, we've been talking about things in the medical field for even before the vaccines came out. We've been talking about fresh air. We've been talking about sunshine, diet, exercise, hydrotherapy. And we've had millions of people watch these videos. And it's because people really want to have good, scientific-based, unbiased information about what they can do. This is not the time to politicize these things. And people are very thankful when they can get information that's not based on politics or what they're trying to do to coerce you into voting one particular way. Look at people that you trust. You have a family physician, if you have one. You've been treated by them for years. They obviously have your best interest at stake. They're not going to lead you down the road. Ask them, what do they think? Ask people who you trust. There's a study that was done. People who are convinced to go one way or the other are convinced not by some people on YouTube or by some politician. It's people that they know. It's their relatives. It's their friends and family. So let me give you some examples of what I mean when I say let's go to the Bible and the spirit of prophecy, just very briefly. If you think about the mandates that we've had, I don't personally think that mandates are actually doing what we want them to do. But the fact of things being mandated is not foreign to us. I mean, let's look back at Moses. Moses was the first epidemiologist. He was the first public health director. When someone had leprosy, they had to go to Moses and the high priest and had to determine whether or not they were clean. They had to be a mandatory quarantine for 7 days. And then they were rechecked. You can see this in Leviticus chapter 13. The whole chapter is based on basically mitigating public health. So if the question is what would God do if he was in charge of the government? Well, we already know what the answer is to that because he's already had to deal with this. And he gave Moses laws of how to deal with this. I mean, even King Uzziah, who was diagnosed with leprosy because he went into the temple, had to live out his life in isolation. You can see that in 2 Chronicles 26, verse 21. The Mishnah had added a lot of rules up until the time when even Jesus Christ himself was healing people in Israel. And look at Luke chapter 17, written by a physician. He recorded this. There was 10 lepers, and they came to him saying, have mercy on us. And Jesus Christ, the best physician that we've ever known, the one that would heal people, he recreated them. I mean, he didn't send them away saying, you know, your immune system can deal with this by itself. He supernaturally healed these people. And what did he do? He sent them away and told them, go show yourself to the priest. In essence, what he was doing was, Christ was basically reinforcing the public health system in the country. He wasn't there to tear down the public health system. And these were corrupt priests. Let's not mince words. Corrupt priests. Christ knew exactly every sin that they were doing. They would come out and lie. They were hypocrites. And yet he sent the lepers to these high priests to make sure that they were healed, because that was the only way that they could enter into society. So, you know, when we look at these things, we have to be cognizant of this. We have to look at the whole Bible and understand what's going on. So we learn in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 that love is patient, it's forbearant, it shows humility, courtesy, selflessness, empathy. And so when we look at these things, rather than jumping to conclusions and go to Revelation 13, we ought to be looking at what 1 Corinthians 13 tells us to do, what we see in Leviticus 13. And I would just add to that what's in Romans 13. And what's Romans 13? We read that authorities were appointed by God. One of the main responsibilities of government is the protection of its people. And so I think the Bible is one of the main things that we can see. The last thing I'll leave you with is the spirit of prophecy, and then I'll wrap up. And for that, I just wanted to share just a quote from Ellen G. White, and I'll go ahead and put that up on the screen here. Actually, this is not a quote from Ellen White. This is a letter that was written by her son regarding vaccination in terms of who do we consult with when we're making medical decisions. And I think this is very important. This is a letter that was written by W.C. White in St. Helena, California in 1924 to a brother, L.C. Kellogg, in Loma Linda, California. And he says, "Dear Brother Kellogg, I hold in my hand your letter of January 20th, asking if I can tell you what the attitude of Mrs. E.G. White was toward vaccination. She regarded it as a perplexing question. I do not remember her ever saying or writing that she had special instruction regarding vaccination. In my earlier days, she spoke of it as something dangerous and related my own experience. She was talking about the smallpox vaccine, which actually had bacteria in it at that time because it wasn't cleaned. It wasn't used in the same way that the modern ones are. She said, the letter goes on. She said that as a child, I was perfectly healthy until I was vaccinated and that my health was much impaired. Mother listened attentively to the argument that the methods of vaccination had been improved. And when in our travels, we were brought to a large city where smallpox was raging and the matter was discussed as to whether or not I and my associates should be vaccinated, she offered no objection. And in the view of the argument of physicians, notice here that this is a medical question, and Ellen White is listening to physicians, people who are experts in this field, that it was not only for our own safety, but for the safety of others, I and my associates were vaccinated. So basically that is, the question is who should you turn to? We should look at the spirit of prophecy. We should look at the Bible. And when we're talking about a specific area, we should ask experts in that field.
And I think one thing that I picked up there that's, I think, really important is to put the best construction on others' motives, kind of the 1 Corinthians 13 idea. And I think when it comes to even our public health officials, you know, before we jump to that conspiracy theory that these folks are all doing this to control us and kill us, maybe we ought to first of all think, well, what could be some reasons that they might be doing this? And we'll get more into that in a little bit. That could actually come from a good place. Now, whether you agree with it all, again, we can talk more about that. Any other follow-up comments? Thank you, Dr. Schwelt, for that. Any follow-up comments to Dr. Schwelt's thoughts there? I think those were well said.
Yeah, I think he put that very well. I appreciated the overview and the sharing of the quote from Ellen White's son. And he didn't mention the letter from her personal secretary a few years later, where her personal secretary indicated that not only did Ellen White approve her son and workers getting the vaccination, but she got it too. in order to protect herself and her neighbors. Some question the validity of this quote, but there's no reason to believe that her personal secretary, who was a man of high integrity and ethics, would have made something like that up. And it's certainly consistent with what Willie White had said earlier. He may have omitted that from his letter, not wanting to put sort of undue influence of her example forward. But by the time that Secretary Robinson wrote his letter in the 1930s, the church leadership in the health department had generally moved towards supporting and accepting vaccines. So his remarks were uncontroversial in that context. So I think those are important points.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, and we're
Could
going
I
to
make
get more.
a comment there?
Sure. Go for it, Dr. Che.
Well, it's just that, we did a whole program on Med Missionary about this subject of Ellen White and whether or not she got vaccinated and the evidence for that. And, the thing about this letter that her secretary Robinson made, I can't remember, was it 1930 something? He had opportunity to answer the same exact question prior to her dying, in the year that she died, when she was still alive. And he, in that letter, did not state anything like that she had gotten vaccinated when he had the opportunity to. So I think that whether or not she got vaccinated, I think that would be something that people who have questions about that, I think it's understandable that they might question that.
Okay, fair enough. Dr. Miller, let me jump to you with the next question. Have Christians, and specifically Seventh-day Adventists, all of the panelists on this panel are members of the Adventist Church. Maybe we have viewers from different faith communities, but that's where this group right here is, have their membership. And so we're kind of thinking about some issues in relation to our history as a church as well. Have we as Adventists and as Christians in general faced pandemics and government health restrictions, even vaccine mandates in the past? And if so, how have Adventists in the past, Christians in the past, reacted to those restrictions and mandates?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's really been a bit of a puzzle as a church historian to try to understand. There is certainly, I would cast it as a minority, but significant position in the Adventist Church among our laity and membership in opposition to vaccines. And yet this is really something of a modern phenomenon. If you look back in early Protestantism, for instance, you asked about Christians generally, and Martin Luther lived at a time when there was plague. And I think that, Martin Luther and his priesthood of believers and his dividing of the world into the temporal realm and the spiritual realm, and his recognition that the government should stay out of the spiritual realm, but had jurisdiction and ability to protect public peace and safety in the temporal realm, and that questions of disease and plague were very much questions of public health and safety. In his own day, he famously said, and there's an article I wrote for the Lake Union Herald, and I've asked for it to be put in the chat, and the quote is in there, that he would pray for God to mercifully protect us. But then he adds, I shall fumigate, help purify the air, administer medicine, and take it. I shall avoid places and persons where my presence is not needed, in order not to become contaminated and thus perchance infect and pollute others, and so cause their death as a result of my negligence. See, this is such a God-fearing faith, because it is neither brash nor foolhardy and does not tempt God. Close quote. It's in his works, volume 43, page 131. The Protestant world, Adventists, were believers in health science. Certainly we had problems with historical evolutionary science, but our appreciation of the science of health was profound. We started medical schools. Now, I don't want to overpaint the picture because there were some dissenting voices. E.J. Wagner famously wrote in England against vaccines and vaccine mandates. But I would suggest he represented a minority position in the church of the day. Just 2 or 3 years later, the Sentinel, a Liberty Sentinel magazine, which is the forerunner of our Liberty magazine today, the American Sentinel, had an article opposing Sunday laws. But in that article, they quoted a prominent law professor of the day saying, quote, "It is settled that the state may compel an unwilling citizen to be vaccinated, but on what ground? Not because if he remains unvaccinated, he would be liable to catch the smallpox, nor yet because if he did catch it, he would probably die, but solely because his unvaccinated condition renders him specially liable to become a source of contagion to others." And then, of course, they went on to contrast this with Sunday laws and Sunday keeping. Whether you keep Sunday or not doesn't impact the health of other people. But for our religious liberty leaders to write at the time, to quote favorably this law professor on vaccine mandates, and this was even several years before the Supreme Court decision, Massachusetts versus Johnson in 1905, that upheld vaccine mandates as constitutional. It was very interesting to me to see not only this quote in our Liberty magazine at the time, but also no response against the Supreme Court decision in 1905. And then in 1918, in the 1919 pandemic, I went through the pages of our Lake Union Herald and the Adventist Review looking for articles and couldn't find no objections on the basis of religious freedom, either for quarantining, closing down churches, or the taking of medication. Of course, at that point, you didn't have mandatory vaccines for the influenza, but there was just, this wasn't viewed as a religious liberty matter. And I think we have to chalk it up to the influence of fundamentalism on our church in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, where we began to take an anti-intellectual, anti-scientific view of the world. And these anti-vax strains came from outside Adventism, not from things Ellen White did or said. And they've been absorbed into our culture to some degree, and we're needing to respond to them.
So what you're saying is that both the vaccine mandates, vaccines, first of all, vaccine mandates, and the anti-vax position have been around for a long time, at least in the modern era, and that Ellen White was aware of these issues. We have no record of her or the church responding to these issues as a religious liberty threat in and of themselves. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's correct. I did mention E.J. Wagner and his comments on it.
Right.
So there were some voices, but these were not voices that were adopted as the position of the church, right. And neither were they endorsed by the prophet. And to the contrary, we have people very close to the prophet getting the vaccines, and if reputable witnesses are to be believed, she taking it herself.
Sure. Okay. Well, let's hear from some other voices. Let's bring the other panelists back in. And any other thoughts on what Dr. Miller just shared there about how Adventists in the past have reacted to vaccine mandates? I think if you want to talk, you may be muted. I think Dr. Che, I see her. You might want to unmute yourself there. There we go. Go for it.
You know, in regards, I don't know that much about the political aspect, maybe, of the anti-vax movement or that kind of thing. I was trained conventionally, and I had no questions about vaccines. It was a surprise to me that anyone would ever think that vaccines might not be helpful and that there could be any harm. And it wasn't until, you know, someone mentioned that they had written a book about vaccines that I was introduced to this subject. And so I went home and researched it. And then somehow I was introduced to people who had suffered vaccine injury. And one of them was a woman that my friend Mercy had helped, who had a 2-year-old boy who was 14 pounds, 2 years old, could not walk because he had failure to thrive. And his family was reported to Child Protective Services by concerned church members because they thought the family was too healthy. And the child had hypereosinophilia, which is a condition that's associated with severe food allergies. And my friend Mercy helped them come up with an infant formula and taught them how to do enemas, and the child was able to reverse. But by that time, he got reported to Child Protective Services and had to get hospitalized. And so in the hospital, they said, well, no, you can't be feeding your child this. You have to feed them infant formula that comes from company. And they then proceeded to put an NG tube down the child's nose, and he was force-fed 24 hours a day. And then they put in a TPN. And this child almost died, but praise the Lord, God spared his life. And they did discharge the child. He was able to go home on the stipulation that he take this infant formula. And the reason that I'm telling you this is because this was not a family that was anti-science or anything. I asked the mother, I said, Daniela, how did it get to this point that your child got so sick? And she said, well, at 2 months, he got his vaccines and he developed terrible eczema. At 4 months, he got his vaccines and he started having diarrhea. At 6 months, he got his vaccines and he started throwing up until the point that he was throwing up 30 times a day. And of course, that would explain why he couldn't grow. At 2 years of age, he weighed 14 pounds. And the reason that I'm bringing this up today is because when I heard of this story, I wanted to share it. I wanted to tell people, this is what's happening. And this child is being forced to go home on infant formula that the first ingredient is corn syrup. At the risk of losing their child, this family has to feed the child what the hospital says. This is the only thing. This is scientifically proven that this is the only thing your child can eat. And for me to even question that as a physician, I'm considered unscientific. For me to even question that as a physician, I'm considered to be unintellectual. And I just want to put out there that I think it really limits scientific research for physicians not to be able to question things. When I went on a podcast and the podcaster found out that I had said that vaccines could be associated with autoimmune disease and could be inflammatory triggers, he said, Dr. Chen, haven't we established that vaccines are safe and effective? And I said, yes, well, maybe so. But in the literature, we are finding that it can be associated with autoimmune disease. And we're seeing this in our clients. And he wouldn't allow me to continue being a guest on his podcast. And so I've seen this, for a long time, that if you are, a voice that's different than mainstream, you're considered to be unscientific, unintellectual, and you're not given a voice. But it's now that it's come to this point that it affects so many people that people are starting to look into this issue. But it's not a new issue, is what I'm saying. And many of these families, they're not against intellectual things. They're not against science. They're people that wanted to go along with what their doctor said. They trusted them, and then they were left on their own, or even worse, they were threatened with the loss of their children and the ability to have a right to say, this is what can enter into my child's body.
So thank you, Dr. Che. And I want to let Dr. Schwelt, I see he has his hand up, so let him speak. But just back to her, I want to get into these issues about the actual vaccines themselves. So thank you for saying that, Dr. Che. But I want to go back and just kind of go back to what Dr. Miller said before we get into the actual vaccines. And that is this, and I think this is an important point that he made. And I've done a little research myself. Of course, all of us have been interested about vaccines even more in the last year than we probably have ever before, right? And as a parent of young children, when my children were vaccinated, I was vaccine hesitant. I'll be honest, I was. My wife's the physician. She said, no, it's, she had her reasons. And I said, well, I'm going to do my own research. So I read a couple books and came to my own conclusions, and our children are vaccinated. I think with the interesting thing about the history, though, is that you go back to the mid 1800s and we have anti-vax movements, there in England that were opposed to the vaccine mandate there. We have, mandatory vaccinations, in Massachusetts, 1905 Jacobson case, right? We've got all this going on when Ellen White was alive, when the early Adventists had an opportunity to stand up, take a stand about a religious liberty issue, as many of the folks in our church believe it is. And I respect that view. What I'm trying to say is historically, we haven't done that. And I think that's a significant thing we need to recognize when we look at other people and say, you aren't, stand up for my rights. Historically, that was our position. Dr. Schwelt, what would you like? You had your hand up there. Go for it.
Yeah, I just wanted to compliment what Dr. Miller was saying there with Waggoner, and the other half of that righteousness by faith dynamic duo. If we could just share the screen here. This is from Alonzo T. Jones, A.T. Jones. I mean, the guy who testified in front of the Senate subcommittee hearing on the Blair bill, which was the Sunday law. And he took a lot of people to task and was taken to task, one of them being the Reverend J.A. Knowles, the secretary of the American Sabbath Union. And over that issue of, when does the rights of someone else get into the rights of you? And this is what he wrote in an open letter to the Reverend regarding that issue. He said, and that was the testimony to the Senate committee, distinctly denied that the state can ever of right legislate in relation to anything in the first 4 commandments of the Decalogue. Okay, that was talking about the Sunday law. But if any man in the exercise of his rights under the first 4 commandments, and in this case under the 4th commandment, should invade the rights of his neighbor, as I expressed it, by endangering his life, his liberty, or his property, or attack his character, or invade his rights in any way, the government has the right to prohibit it because of not religion, but incivility, but with never any question as to whether the man is religious or irreligious, and with never a purpose or thought of forbidding the free exercise of any man's right to work on the day or days as he chooses. Now, this was back in 1888. This is well before 1905, but clearly the position of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and indeed the top arguer in the Senate for the Seventh-day Adventists is that there is reason for the government to limit liberties if it has to do with civility, life, property, etc.
So let's jump into the actual talk about vaccines for a minute. So, and Dr. Che, you kind of got us to that point. Thank you for doing that. And I should add, I'd like to hear from the medical doctors on our panel today about the issue of whether vaccines do cause injury. I mean, from what I can tell, when I take my child or myself, I go to the doctor, I'm given a ream of paper every time I get a vaccine that says, here are the risks associated with this vaccine. So it doesn't seem like it's a secret that vaccines do cause injuries in some people sometimes. We even have a court system that is designated for those who do have vaccine injuries, because really back in the era of Ronald Reagan, who signed the law, my understanding is, that protected vaccine companies from lawsuits over a certain amount, just like doctors are protected from lawsuits over a certain amount, so that, we could argue whether that's good or bad or whatever. But the fact is that we recognize in our legal system and in our medical system that vaccines are not perfect, that there are times when they can, hurt somebody. But I think statistically, and I want to hear from you guys, the vaccines do more good than harm, vastly. And that is my understanding. Now, I know there's disagreement on that, but let me ask Dr. Eric Walsh. I haven't heard from him yet. Dr. Walsh, should Christians and Adventists in particular support the basic science, the idea of vaccination as being in harmony with the biblical health message? Some are arguing that the concept of vaccination, of putting and you could describe it better than me, some sort of a germ in your body, I guess, or however it works, is antithetical to the 8 laws of health and the health message. What would you say from a Seventh-day Adventist perspective, a biblical Christian perspective on that?
I would start. I'm quiet on purpose. I like to listen and hear what other people think, and I'm even reading in the comments. I think you have to understand first and foremost, the Bible describes us as being fearfully and wonderfully made. The human machinery is incredibly complex and sophisticated, and so once you understand that, you understand that we were designed to be able to be exposed to multiple antigens at the same time from birth and even before birth in some ways, all the way through life. And our immune system is able to adapt, adjust, and as you're exposed to something, your immune system makes a decision as to whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, and it will respond. So, for example, I'm allergic to papayas. My immune system, for whatever reason, picks up papayas, and I have an allergy. It's a mild thing, but it's a real allergy. What science figured out slowly and begrudgingly over centuries, it goes back a long ways, the idea of inoculating someone with something to prevent a worse disease later on, is that if you can give people either smaller doses or an attenuated virus or bacteria or a piece of the virus or the bacteria, the immune system can learn to recognize it, destroy it before that thing can cause full-blown disease. We live in a world, because of sin, that has had many, many pandemics and pestilences. In Matthew 24 and verse 7, Jesus actually says that this is a sign of the end, that there would be famines and pestilence and earthquakes in diverse places. He says in Matthew 24 verse 8, this is the beginning of sorrows, which is where I think we should be focusing. Whatever's going on now and whatever argument we're having about vaccines now is only, the hors d'oeuvres for what I think the world is about to face. And I think it's why it's so dangerous that such a topic has so divided our church. A divided church is what Satan wants. He wants us arguing amongst ourselves. He wants us calling each other names and pointing fingers and accusing people of different things, because the Holy Spirit doesn't do well in a divided body of Christians. So we can become powerless because our energies are zapped, arguing with each other. I say all of that to say that once you understand the science behind vaccines, you understand that there is clearly a role for them. There are a lot of people say, well, smallpox wasn't eradicated by vaccines, or polio wasn't eradicated by vaccine, but you'd have a really hard time in the real world with the real data making that case. It wasn't hygiene. I had teachers when I was a child who had polio from the generation before me, and still sat in wheelchairs or walked with canes and braces. And we don't see that anymore. And vaccines are why, because what we need is, you need herd immunity for a pestilence or a pandemic to go away. And there are only 2 ways that we have with modern science to get to herd immunity. And one of them is either you get the disease and get immunity, or there's a viable vaccine that is used to give us immunity. Those are the 2 ways out of this pandemic, like any other pandemic. And we're going to get out of this pandemic. We're already, in my opinion, heading out of this pandemic because the Delta wave was smaller than the wave we had last winter. So as a Christian, getting a vaccine is not a problem as long as you are informed about the vaccine and it's your choice. I do not believe in vaccine mandates. I'm not someone who thinks you need to mandate vaccines. In fact, I think the strong mandate push has harmed the cause of this vaccine, because I think it's made people more skeptical of the vaccine rather than the reverse. There's a lot of other things I think that could be done in terms of even our science around what antibodies are produced if you've already had the disease. But I do believe, I'll just state it clearly for this vaccine, I do believe the vaccine is safe, and I do believe that the vaccine is effective. But I don't, but I'm not one who says, you should be forced to get it. And I think that's the problem. I think we're in a zone here where people are looking at this as an either or situation. There's a lot of other things that can be done to protect you from COVID, everything from the laws of health that we all believe in. There are good studies that show a more whole food, plant-based diet actually reduces the risk of COVID-19 infection and the severity of disease. But at the end of the day, nothing is 100%. And so the vaccines work to try and protect the most people at a time. 3 to 6% of people in America do not have good immune systems. So even if they are vaccinated or get COVID, they're going to still be at risk of severe disease later on.
Okay. Any other follow-up thoughts on that from the rest of the panelists? Thank you, Dr. Walsh.
Not being one of the physicians, I think it's a great question that you've asked there, and I'd like to ask my fellow or the physicians here, just with some of the conspiracy theories that are, and maybe they're not conspiracy theories, but we hear this all the time. I'm not someone in the health field, but things being said such as microchip, and this is the mark of the beast, or not, even issues of, well, this is being fetal tissue is being used in these vaccines. Those are the things that I'm hearing just from the average person in terms of them not taking the vaccine. And the other that I've seen in the comments here, which is a question that I have as well, is there's kind of this sense that any kind of modern science is not the health message. And I struggle with that, because to me, the health message, or what was cutting edge at the time of the health message in the latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, was cutting edge. Mm-hmm. So this concept of anything that's modern science is not the health message, and everything is just natural. I think that goes against, I think that's ahistorical for Adventists.
I was going to just mention that, if we go back to the Protestant Reformation, this idea that the Bible and spiritual things should never, ever use technology, or that technology corrupts spiritual things, I think is as far as from the East as it is to the West. I mean, look at the Gutenberg printing press. If there was one technological advancement that allowed the word of God to be spread like the leaves of autumn across the planet, it was that technology that was invented. If we go to Ellen White's vision on the health message, I mean, the cornerstone of Adventist living was that vision. That vision happened just a few years after a gentleman in the UK by the name of Bessemer, who was able to finalize a production of converting iron ore into steel. Well, why would that be so important? Well, that allowed the United States to put in the transcontinental railway, allowed transportation to occur. There was no way that if you were in the Northeast, you could have a healthy vegetarian diet, because there was no way to get fresh vegetables to that part of the country without the railroad. I mean, God invents these things and puts these things into position just at the right time. I could go on and on about how technology. Look at all of our media. All of our media are now being broadcast over the internet. So this idea that technology is bad, if any one of you, God forbid, were to get in a car accident, I can guarantee you that if you needed to have surgery, you would be taken to the hospital. You would probably go immediately into trauma surgery. You would be given a vaporous anesthetic that is made by a very big corporation and makes a lot of profits, and I'm sure have been sued up teen times. But you'd be very thankful that you didn't have to go through what they went through the Civil War, where they gave you a little whiskey and chopped off your leg. I mean, let's be reasonable here. There are people in Pennsylvania, and there are Christian scientists who embrace this idea that they're not going to have any technology in their life, and I don't think that's. I've been to Elmshaven. I mean, Ellen White was one of the first women in her house that had electricity. She had a phone book. She had a telephone. She embraced technology. So I don't see where this is coming from.
Well, and so thank you, Dr. Swalt, for those comments. And I'm going to say that I would, I don't know that everyone on the other side of this issue would be anti-science, right, or anti-technology. And I want to actually go to Dr. Che and ask Dr. Che a question next. And that is this: in addition to the 8 laws of health, which we as Adventists believe in, and Dr. Walsh, Dr. Swalt, we've all talked about that. Should believers support medical intervention or medications, pharmaceuticals, medical technology of any kind? As Dr. Swalt is very well pointed out, that, hey, and this is something I've heard from other physicians too. Listen, if you don't want to get the vaccine, that is your choice. Although we do have mandates, we'll discuss in a minute. But if you get COVID, it's likely that if it gets bad, you're going to go to the hospital and you're going to be treated with a lot of drugs that are themselves experimental. Some of them have been tested on fetal tissue. a lot of those issues that people are bringing up with the COVID vaccine are the same for ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, and you name it. So Dr. Che, where's the balance here? Let's start with you first. Do we as Adventists, Seventh-day Adventists who believe in the health message, believe also in medical science and using other medical interventions?
Yeah, I guess we got started on that question with our last question. And so, so for those of your audience that aren't familiar with me, I do ophthalmology. And as an ophthalmologist, I do have to use technology, and I appreciate it very much. And I really love my job. I love doing cataract surgery. And I really, really appreciate all that technology has given to us. I think as far as whether or not drugs are ever necessary, yes, I think that they are very helpful at times, and especially in acute situations, as you mentioned, Steve. And, there's that story of that missionary father in Australia who had a son who died of malaria. And this father didn't know how to do natural remedies. He didn't know if he should treat his son with quinine. And he asked Ellen White when she visited Australia, would I have sinned if I had given my son quinine when he had malaria? And she said, no, you would not have sinned, because we have to do the best that we can do. So I think the balance is this: when we don't know what to do with natural means, it is not a sin to use drug therapy. But the balance for that is that God has called this church to something that is far higher than what current science is saying is the standard. That is the thing that I think we have totally lost sight of. The question of should Christians and Adventists support medical interventions, pharmaceuticals? I think that, perhaps the question should be, how many people have died because Seventh-day Adventists have not fulfilled the mission that they were called to, that they should find a way of healing that is altogether higher than what the world is doing. And, I just want to read here a quote. It says that when she was talking about sanitariums and how they should be built, she said that our institutions would use altogether new methods of treating the sick. These methods would be hygienic, discarding almost entirely the use of drugs. And in a letter to John Harvey Kellogg at Battle Creek, she said, the students in your institution are not to be educated to regard drugs as a necessity. They are to be educated to leave drugs alone. And there was a medical student who wrote a letter to Mrs. White and asked, Mrs. White, when you say drugs, are you just referring to the heavy metals and the heavy drugs, or are you referring to like iodine and these supplements that we use? And she said that these are all drugs. They just differ in as far as the amount of baleful influence that they leave behind. But every drug does leave behind a baleful influence. So in regards to whether to use natural remedies is unscientific, I think that this is the question. Who is it that defines the science? Is it going to be when it is funded by a large multi-million-dollar research and development committee? I was at a scientific conference, and I was exhibiting our book, the Autoimmune Plant-Based Cookbook. And a surgeon came by. She was a liver transplant surgeon. And one of my first patients when I got into my third year of medical school, he was a patient who had end-stage cirrhosis of the liver. He was the yellowest man I've ever seen, and he died. And I remember that when I was a medical student, I was thinking, I bet you if we did hydrotherapy, I bet you if we did charcoal that we could help this person, but I didn't have the courage to do it because I didn't know the research. There wasn't a whole lot, Google wasn't that much around. And so I didn't pursue it. And so I asked this hepatic surgeon, I said, hey, would you be interested in doing research on charcoal and, your patients? And she said, no, we can't do that. We can only do evidence-based medicine. I said, hey, you work at a university. You're a surgeon. You create the evidence. Can't you do research on this? It would be super safe. You just do standard of care plus charcoal. And she said, no, we can't do that because it has to be evidence-based medicine. And so you can see that there is going to be like this, it's going to be very difficult to get science, to get evidence-based science that everybody in the scientific community is going to accept as being valid if there isn't that freedom for physicians to explore these ideas. And now in regards to this vaccine, for instance, I, as a physician, simply for questioning it, I stand the risk of losing my license. I'm being restricted as far as what I can even explore as is this better? Is there anything that's better than this? And I think that that's going to be a difficult thing for people who are truly interested in true science.
Thank you for that, Dr. Chase. So here's a question for you, I guess, just to help our lay people out there. What are some principles that can guide us, as we approach what medical interventions are good and what are bad, for non-acute, type of medical issues. And the other thing would be this, in a world where most people don't follow the health message, they're not eating a plant-based diet, they're not doing these things that are going to keep them from lower their risk to, severe disease from COVID. Would you recommend that they not get a vaccine that could, statistically help them under those circumstances?
Okay, well, so I really appreciate these questions. You asked me two, and today I'm kind of like Eric Walsh, where I have 3 sermons that I'm preaching today. And so it's kind of hard for me to keep track of everything. But you're asking me what I would recommend principles as far as when to use some of these medical interventions or not. And the second one, what was that?
Well, let's start with that one. Yeah.
Okay. As I said, if you don't know any better, if you don't know anything that's better, go along with the medical therapy. But see, you're asking questions of what should the individual do? Like, is it a sin for you to do something when you don't know any better? I don't think so, right? But on the other hand, as a church, what are you going to call people to do? And at this time in Earth's history, when we have a pandemic and we have a health message, what is it that we're going to promote? So those are the 2 questions. For me, as a Seventh-day Adventist physician who believes in the health message and who believes that this can save lives, we are helping tons of people, coaching them through COVID and keeping people out of the hospital. When people get to the hospital, we coach them there as well. And so we're able to help a lot of people using these natural remedies. And we think that this is a great opportunity to motivate people to do these things. And I just want to share one more thing with you as far as technology, science, and natural remedies, and as far as the anti-intellectualism that people might think that is happening. We had a lady, for instance, who had kidney failure, end-stage kidney failure, and we had actually helped her get off of dialysis a few years ago following this protocol, but she felt like, it's a bit much, went back on dialysis. In any case, she ended up in the hospital with infection. White blood cell count was 9.8, and it started climbing. They put her in on IV antibiotics. I think they put her on at least 2, and her white blood cell count is supposed to be probably less than 7,000. And it went up from 9.8, kept climbing up to 22,000. And she was in the hospital for days, getting septic, blood, bacteria in the blood. And she prayed. She called Mercy. Mercy said, hey, if she was at home, I would tell you to do an enema with onion and garlic broth. And her daughter had prayed about it, and she thought, Lord, if you want this to happen, help me to find an enema bag, and help me to have uninterrupted time that I can do this in the hospital without a nurse walking in. And it happened. She was able to do that, gave her mother 2 enemas. The next morning she walked in, the white blood cell count came down to 17,000. That day they stopped the antibiotics and they kept on doing the enemas, 3 enemas the next day. And she The next morning, in 2 days of doing enemas, after being in the hospital for days with a white blood cell going up and becoming septic, her white blood cell came down to 11,500 doing enemas, no antibiotics because the doctor agreed to stop them since they weren't working. And she was able to go home 2 days after starting doing these onion and garlic broth enemas. So what I'm saying is that a lot of times we have this misconception that it is anti-science, it's anti-intellectual to be doing these things, and that, you know, science or, you know, modern science is so much better than God's ways. But God tells us in the Bible and in the spirit of prophecy that his ways are so much better than what the world has to offer. And that's simply all that we're trying to say, is that if the church promotes a way of thinking that the vaccines are the only way, I personally don't believe that. I haven't seen that. So that's all that we are trying to let people know, that I think that there is another way.
And this is I think thank you for that, Dr. Che. Now, this is a question though for us. Is that what the church is doing? Is the church saying the vaccine is the only way? Is it an either or question for?
Not at all.
I hope that's not something the church is saying. If it is,
You
that's
know, can I just share something, Steve?
But with all of the anecdotal evidence that I'm hearing Dr. Joyce give, there's so many anecdotal evidence. I've seen people who are doing all of these natural things and dying and going to the hospital.
Yes.
So what is this? I'm really struggling with this idea that any kind of modern science is not God's plan as well. That it's only one way. I think we're in trouble when we start thinking that do you not believe that God also gives wisdom and insight for new, like Dr. Rogers said, technology? Why is it only one way? And our extrapolation of God's only way is based upon what? You don't find certain prescriptions in the scriptures. You find Jesus doing miraculous healing. A lot of what we say is natural remedy and so forth is a lot of it from Ellen White's writings. They're not from script. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. But I think we have to be careful that we not say that anything modern, anything that we have come to learn through understanding, God gives wisdom and progresses with truth, that is not God's way. To me, that's a dangerous way to go.
I just want to say here that the reason that this is coming up, that the vaccine is the only way, is that that is the impression that the masses are being left with. You know, I had a patient that asked me, "Are you vaccinated?" And I asked her, "Why are you asking me this when this is a personal matter?" And she said, "Well, because I signed a document stating that I would help stop the spread of COVID. And this is my way of doing it, making sure everyone's vaccinated." So what is happening, the reason that I'm being mandated to get vaccinated is because what people are left with is that there's no other way. And when I ask people about this and they say, "Yeah, you know, what you want to do, that's up to you. I can't force you to go against your conscience." But I say, "Hey, what would happen if you didn't think, like, say that you thought that I was really, really risking your safety? Would you still believe that? Would you still believe that I have the right to not be forced to do something that I feel uncomfortable with?" And then they say, "Well, Joyce, in regards to the vaccine, if we don't do this, what else is there?" Adventists have that question as much as anybody else.
All right. Well, and so maybe that's a messaging problem. I don't hear from what I'm hearing from any official Adventist source that the vaccine is the only way to go. And so let's hear from Dr. Walsh. I think you were wanting to say something.
I just want to jump in and say, I think I definitely haven't heard it from an official source. I know myself, and I know Dr. Schultz as well. We have been putting out things from the beginning of the pandemic on the importance of things like vitamin D. Fruits and vegetables is a great, like I mentioned earlier, great study on those who are more plant-based in their eating and having less COVID. And we've been reproducing and sending that information out. The challenge for a lot of what Dr. Ch was saying is that the way that we judge these things, and this is something that lay people don't understand. We don't just do things in medicine. What we do is we try and use randomized, double-blinded control studies so that we know for a fact things work because of a few things. One, there's a strong thing called the placebo effect, right? So if you just say, I'm going to give you everyone that comes down with a cough, I'm going to give them an apple, and you tell them, look, this apple has been genetically modified to cure a cough. Some people's cough are going to get better just because they believe their cough is going to get better, right? So the reason we do these studies is that way. And I think, as someone who believes in natural remedies, believes in hydrotherapy, believes in the power of a lot of herbal treatments and so forth. I've spent time in places like Wildwood. I believe in these things. But I think the problem you have in this church is that we use too much anecdotal stories to try and make the case for them, when we really should be doing strong scientific studies that would further our point and make us far more legitimate in what we're trying to do. I think that's the course, and I think that's what's next for us. We can't go to the world and say, listen, do this, and the world is going to say, okay, as much as people hate the pharmaceutical companies, and let me say, people are in the chat are saying doctors own stocks in pharmaceutical. I don't own a dime of stock in a pharmaceutical company. Never have, never will. Don't see pharmaceutical reps, none of that stuff. So it's an unfortunate thing. They're saying, well, nurses don't. I know more nurses who have money in pharmaceutical company stocks than I do, or than most doctors do. So it's an unfortunate reality that we start to think that people have these agendas. I don't have those agendas. I would much prefer that our Adventist health message was strong in its ability to be evaluated using a pure scientific methods like randomized, double-blinded, controlled control studies. But we don't always have that information. So if we are ever going to take our health message to the world, we're going to need that data. It's necessary if we're going to take that. These are some of what we do to the world, because the world isn't going to just trust us. Just like we don't want to trust the pharmaceutical companies, the world is not going to trust us. When Steve made an excellent point earlier, the majority of Americans live a very sickly lifestyle. It produces disease. And part of the reason I think the government and these industries are so bent on the vaccine is because many of them do not see any alternative but a vaccine. They're looking for a swing. And it started with Donald Trump. Donald Trump looked at this and created warp speed because he wanted an out from the pandemic, because he knew he'd lose the next election, or he thought he'd lose the next election if he didn't fix it. And so he used this program to get these vaccines developed pretty quickly. Now, with all of that said, there were 70,000 people in the studies around these vaccines. And we want to use a single case to make our point. That's the challenge we're going to have. We're going to need large studies from Wildwood, Uchee Pines, and all these places coming together and saying, look, when you case and control, and you look at these studies around hydrotherapy and other things, here's what we can show you is the benefit. And there's some data, don't get me wrong, but we have to be very careful. We also have to be careful assuming that because someone says, I think the vaccine is safe and effective, it means that we think that that's the only thing you should do. Dr. Schultz has a great diagram on this cheese method of protection. He does his talk. It's very true. When you're the one taking care of the patients dying, it's been challenging for me to talk to families who've lost people to COVID. And I can't tell them, listen, do hydrotherapy and start eating vegetables right now. It's too, they've died, or they're already in the ICU. They're very sick. I tell people that as soon as I can in the process, but it's often too late. And it is a very emotionally painful thing when I had to just the other day tell one of my patients that her husband was not, he wasn't coming back. The two of them got COVID, and he died. And I think if you're on the front lines as the one telling people about these deaths, you're not worried about VAERS reports. You're not worried about whether or not numbers have been exaggerated. When you're looking people in the eye and having to tell them that they've died, I've not had to do that to one person vaccinated. I've not had one person vaccinated come in that I've had to say, listen, the vaccine caused this disease. But I have had hundreds, maybe by now thousands over the last year and a half, who have gotten sick and gone into the hospital and become very, very ill from the disease itself. And I think when you from that standpoint, you ask yourself, is there enough evidence to say that the risk and the benefits align so that the benefit of the vaccine outweighs the risk based on the science in front of us? If that science changes, my opinion would change, my view would change. And this is one of the reasons why I do not see this as a religious liberty issue, because as the science comes back, this will change people's viewpoint, which people's viewpoints are already changed. Religious liberty is around immutable moral issues that do not change. Are biblical and cannot change. And this vaccine and this pandemic will fade away like every other pandemic and every other situation like this has. And a new thing will rise up later on. As they say in Jamaica, it'll one day be 7-day news. But how we as a church act in a crisis is important, because if we lose Christ in the crisis, then the crisis really was not the issue. Our lack of Christ was. And when you read comments that are targeting people, calling them names, assuming things about them, it tells me the vaccine isn't an issue. Get vaccinated, don't get vaccinated, I don't care. Find Christ. Learn to be kind, because that's what's going to get you into eternity. Whether or not you're vaccinated is not going to cause anyone to lose their soul, despite some people telling people that. But not having Jesus Christ, you're going to be in trouble.
So thanks, Dr. Walsh. Jonathan Cherney.
Yeah, I just had a quick question. I haven't heard any official statement saying, the vaccines are the only way to go, but just a question by our hospitals, some of our hospitals, some of our universities requiring vaccines for you to work there or to go to school there. Aren't they in essence saying vaccines are the only way to go? I mean, they're not saying, you can use, natural remedies or other forms of PPE, protection and things like that instead of the vaccine. And so, even though they're not officially saying it, kind of in essence, they are, it seems like.
I just would like to step in here because I am connected with one of our universities, and I don't know any of our universities here in the United States that require the vaccine, either for employers or for students. I have a daughter at Walla Walla. I know it's not there. She was at Southern last year, and it's certainly not there. I'm at Andrews. We encourage the vaccine. We don't require it. If you don't get vaccinated, then you are requested to wear masks in all public spaces indoors, and you will be tested on a regular basis. I don't view those as coercive or punitive. Those are merely protective, and I think that's perfectly fine. So it's not fair to say that our colleges are requiring it. Neither do I think it's fair to say our hospitals are on their own requiring it. Some of them do, but as I understand it, those that do have fallen in line because the state is requiring it. It was very difficult. They were losing employees if they required it on their own. They have confidence in it. But from what and Dr. Schwelt can perhaps speak to the hospitals, but you're not correct about the colleges as far as I know. And Dr. Schwelt can speak to the hospitals.
I mean, the only one I know of people that have been terminated and all from La Sierra. So I can't speak to the other colleges, but that's why I said some. And so it seems like, in essence, that at least that university is saying, this is the only way to go.
So in California, I can tell you just in the last day, the governor has signed an order saying that vaccines will be mandatory for both public school and private school as soon as those vaccines are FDA approved. That's the Moderna and going all the way down the Pfizer as well. Those basically, they did have a provision for the hospitals that they could test twice a week, but the sheer amount of cost made it very prohibitive for hospitals to be able to take that. Look, I think that the mandates are actually causing more problems than they are solving. And so personally, and we're going to get into this a little bit later if we have time, but the mandates are another issue that we need to tackle in terms of whether or not they're good or they're being used as a cover for something else or whatever your thought is. But the point is that from a Seventh-day Adventist point of view, from myself and also the institutions that I'm aware of, I don't know of any of those that are doing the mandates on their own, as was mentioned.
Thank you, Dr. Schwelt. And Dr. Schwelt, I'm going to address the question to you in just a minute, but I think an observation here that I have, and maybe Dr. Schwelt, you can kind of jump in on this too, is, when we talk about messaging and telling people as a church, we support the vaccine, we have to understand the context of that. And that is that we're in the middle of a public health crisis, as opposed to when we normally would have our health, cooking schools and things like that and try to get people to live healthy. Hopefully we're still doing those things if we can, but this is a different context. We're saying, by the way, this isn't a situation where you need to get this because, this is not just a lifestyle disease. This is something that could actually kill you in the short term. So yeah, no, I hope that as a church we are saying, hey, we believe in, the biblical health message, but we also believe in science that is supported by good evidence. So Dr. Swell, let's talk about that. There's a lot of controversy. I mean, the comments here, wow, they're blowing up with people saying that the vaccine is not a vaccine, it's gene therapy, it's I don't know what. And I guess I'm being criticized for saying a conspiracy theory. I didn't realize that term was offensive. I'm not lobbing that at anybody here, and I'm just talking about in general. Anyhow, there are a lot of conspiracy theories. I think we would agree, or I don't know what you want to call them, around this vaccine. And so what about the current COVID vaccine?
Untruths. We don't have to call it conspiracy. There are certain untruths. And I asked a question that I didn't get answered. I think I know the answer, but I've got people on here saying it's made out of fetal tissue and it's made with poison and it's made. So that's either true or it's not true, right? I mean, so that's the question. And I think these scientists can tell us that one way or the other.
Let me go to Dr. Swell first. Dr. Che, I want to hear from you in response in just a minute. But Dr. Swell, what about these vaccines? Are they safe and effective in your understanding of the science? And if so, are there any religious reasons why a Christian should not receive the vaccine? So give us your answer on that. And I want to hear from the rest of you as well. Dr. Che, you as well.
Yeah, so I was anxious myself when the vaccines were first being developed. People asked me, are you going to get the vaccine? And I didn't know the answer to that. I didn't know at the time. On our MedCram channel, I was pushing all sorts of possibilities of things that we could do. Sleep has been shown to improve immunity, fresh air, sunlight. Basically, I was taking the 8 laws of health and trying to package it in a way that would help the community. And those videos have gotten over millions and millions of views. And so when the vaccines finally came out and I had to make a decision, it was based on the data and the data of the phase 3 trials. And that's what I had to make that decision on. And that's when I went to go make up my mind. But let's talk about this issue about these vaccines, because there's some people that believe that it's not a vaccine, that it is something different than a vaccine. I just want to go ahead and share with you what the definition is of the vaccine, taken directly from the Oxford Dictionary. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen here in about 2 seconds, and then we can go from there. If you can pull that up. This is a Oxford definition of vaccine: a substance used to stimulate the production of antibodies and provide immunity against one or several diseases, prepared from the causative agent of the disease, its products, or a synthetic substitute, treated to act as an antigen without inducing disease. And so clearly, what we see here is that these mRNA vaccines fit that definition of a vaccine. So if we go back and look at this, there's this thought that these vaccines just came about yesterday. Here is the original paper that showed that you could get messenger RNA into cells. It was published over 30 years ago in Science in 1990. So this is not new technology in any way, shape, or form. And if we look at the timeline, typically, yes, the research, preclinical, phase 1, and therefore all the way down takes a number of years. But what we were able to do in 2020 was to able to scrunch that down. And the question is there's no question that it was accelerated. The question really is were there corners that were cut? And the answer to that is no. The animal studies were done. No, the animals did not die. In fact, they actually did better than the controls. That's why they went to phase 1 human studies and phase 2. And at the same time that they were doing the phase 1, 2, and 3 trials, they were building the factories. Now, that's not something normally that the pharmaceutical companies will do, because there's a lot of risk. Why build the factories if you don't have the answer? That's when the government stepped in, and not all pharmaceutical companies took that money, but some did, to basically balance the risk of that in case it was a failure. But in fact, not only were the phase 3 trials a success, they were an outstanding success in terms of the mRNA. There was over a 90% efficacy in terms of preventing symptomatic disease, and the benchmark was 50%. So no question, it was incredible. There's this topic that goes around that messenger RNA in nanoparticle droplets, lipid droplets, is a brand new technology. It's never been tried on humans before. And that is just absolutely false. If you look in 2018, the FDA approved a drug called patisiran, which is an RNA inside of a nanoparticle of lipids that And it's not like 1 or 2 shots that go intramuscularly. This is actually in polyneuropathy patients. It's an 80-minute infusion that these patients get every 3 weeks. And it's not the 90 micrograms of the Moderna or the 30 micrograms or 100 micrograms of the Moderna, 30 micrograms of the Pfizer. It's 2,100 micrograms. And they're getting this infused into their bloodstream every 3 weeks. And this was FDA approved over 3 years ago. And so this idea that this is brand new technology, it's experimental, it seems as though this is a lot of misinformation that is demonstrably, and we'll get into a little bit more about the problems that happen. I have no problem with people that believe that this should not be a mandate. In fact, I believe the same. I think it should be a choice. There's nothing that's more foreign to me than taking a patient down, strapping them down, and giving them something that they don't want. But on the other hand, what has happened is those people that would like to have, and myself included, that would like to have choice in this, start to find themselves being in bedfellows with people that are peddling false arguments and false theories, things that are demonstrably false, like this. And what happens is that when they are proven false, you are proven to be discredited. And I think that's the problem. We start to bind ourselves up with people who are like-minded, but maybe not correct on things. And then we go down with the ship. So we have, when we go online and we talk about, and we try to correct things that are incorrect. If I say something that is correcting an incorrectness about the vaccine, that doesn't mean that I'm for mandates. That doesn't mean that I'm against the 8 laws of health. It doesn't mean that I'm a liberal. Or that I am anti-science, or whatever it is that you want to group together with whatever it is. It's simply correcting something that is incorrect so that people can make a decision in their own minds and with their own consciences. So please forgive me if I see things that are wrong and I correct them, because I think that's very important. You can't have freedom of choice if you don't have information to base that decision on. So here are some of the data out of Israel that looks at the safety of the Pfizer vaccine. As you can see here, this is based on 1.8 million Israelis who got the Pfizer vaccine. And in blue, you can see that this is the Pfizer vaccine. And the biggest problem was lymphadenopathy, which is what we expect to see when you have a vaccine choice. But with SARS-CoV-2, you can see in yellow, huge increased risk over the vaccine in terms of acute kidney injury, in terms of arrhythmias, blood clots, even myocarditis. In this case, out of 1.8 million people who received either the placebo or the vaccine, there was 3 cases of myocarditis, 3 events per 100,000, I should say. So very low. And look, I don't want to say that there's absolutely no risk with the vaccine. I see every day people being put on blood thinners because they have an irregular heartbeat. And I admit in my intensive care unit all the time, people who have bleeding episodes from being on those blood thinners. Look, everything that we do in life, everything that we don't do in life has risk. I'm not going to tell you that the vaccines don't have risk. What we do in medicine is we weigh the benefits and the risks, and then we come up with a decision about what we ought to do. And so that is what we do. The other thing that I see a lot about is the VA-ERS. This is a system that reports adverse events to the federal government. And so that means that anything that happens to a person, and the rules were changed recently, so that anything that happens to a patient who's had a vaccine, even if there's no possible connection, has to be reported. That's new. That's not the way it used to be, because this is an emergency use authorization medication. So we see this graph all the time that shows all of these deaths just spiked up huge when we started to introduce the COVID vaccines. The interesting thing about this is that this has happened before. So in 2009, with the H1N1 epidemic, we saw that there was a huge increase, as represented here by the red bar, of all of the reporting to the VA-ERS. You'll also notice that there was a lot of vaccines that went up that year too, because there was a lot of flu in 2009. You'll remember that was H1N1. But then you'll notice something very interesting. The number of reports came down substantially after that red bar, although it was increased over the baseline. But the amount of people that were vaccinated, as represented by that purple line, still stayed high. So what was the reason for that? If you look at Google Trends, you can actually see how many times people are searching or thinking about influenza. And you'll see at that time that there was a huge spike on Google Trends for people looking at influenza. And that correlated with the reports of problems with the vaccine. And that even though the amount of vaccinations stayed high afterwards, the reporting came back down again. So that led these researchers to conclude that the peak number in the pregnancy reports observed during 2009 to 2010, following a decrease in reporting, suggested that the 2009 spike in pregnancy reports was stimulated reporting. What that means is that the more people know about something, the more people read about something, the more people hear about something, the more likely they are to report it. And this is exactly what we're seeing with Google Trends with the COVID-19 vaccine. So here's a point, though, I want to make. The US death rate in 100,000 people is 800 deaths a year. So let me just explain that. If you were to take 100,000 people at random and follow them for 12 months, 800 of those people would die because it was just their time to die. Not because you followed them, not because you did anything to them, they just died. And we've been vaccinating for about 7 months when this was looked at in August, and pretty linearly. So the average person would have been vaccinated for an average time of 3.5 months. And in terms of the deadliest time of year, it's been about average going from January to July. So if we do a simple calculation, by the time 7 months went through, we had vaccinated about 166 million people. And if we look at that death rate of 800 per 100,000, and we prorate it for the number of people that we vaccinated, and we prorate it for the average amount of time that they were vaccinated, which is 3.5 months, and we look at the average death rate, we'll come up with about 421,000 people that should have been dead already who have received the vaccine, just based on statistics alone, just based on if it was saline that we injected into their arm. And yet we see a huge reduction in terms of the actual reporting that we're seeing in that. So there is a lot of underreporting, number one. Number two, the other thing that we see is this VAERS registered deaths. And we seem as though it's all being reported very close to when they first get their vaccine. If you think about it, I would be more likely to report a death if it was very close to the vaccine than if I were to report a death a month after or 2 months after. Remember, all of those deaths have to be reported by law. And here we can clearly see that that is not the case, and that is not what's going on. So the point here is that the VAERS is not designed to tell you whether the vaccine is killing people. It's simply a registry that scientists use to compare in the population. And I think a lot of people, a lot of scientists, unfortunately, know this. And yet, for whatever perverse reason, they go out and use this data to prove that the vaccine is killing people. And I think that is deplorable. Again, we have to look at a risk versus benefit ratio and then decide from there where we go. In terms of the efficacy of this vaccine, and I'll finish up here. I know this is going a little long, but if you look here, this is United States data. This is July data. This is Delta data. This is using vaccines. The black line are here on the left, infections, and on the right, hospitalization for those that are unvaccinated, and in blue, those that are fully vaccinated. So you can see clearly that in terms of efficacy in the United States, this is actually in Los Angeles County, where we have a fairly high vaccination rate. The relative risk of hospitalization and cases from unvaccinated is several times higher than it is from the vaccine. And then here's the most up-to-date, if you want to look, you can see here Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, J&J, in terms of preventing infection, in terms of preventing symptomatic COVID-19, severe COVID-19, death, and hospitalization. And the key here is that, yes, it prevents infection, but not as well as it prevents symptomatic COVID-19, severe COVID-19, death, and hospitalization. And so with that, I'll yield up the time.
Thank you, Dr. Swell. And so just to be, that was a lot of data. Thank you for that. I think, as a science, as a layperson myself, I'm sitting here and I'm like, yes, I think I understand. And most of it is very clear. You would say, yes, in your view, the vaccines, at least with the ones that we have enough evidence about, are safe and effective at preventing severe disease and death from COVID. Is that correct?
Yes, and I failed to mention one answer, and that was put to us by the good pastor about fetal cells. So let me be very clear on that, so it's very clear for everybody. And this, I've looked at this myself personally because I have an issue with it as well. The Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines do not use any fetal parts, period, full stop. Now, they have, that being said, in the process of developing them, they have been used in systems that are designed with fetal cells that have come from abortions in the past. So in other words, they've been tested on systems that have cells that came from abortions, but they have not been, they do not contain any of the cells. Now, that being said, I don't believe that they need to be tested on these things. And it's unfortunate that the companies continue to use these things. And I wish they would take this objection and redesign their studies so that they don't have to do that. I would also mention that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine does actually have in it materials that have come from the production of fetal cells as well. And that's unfortunate as well. But I would also mention to you very quickly that there are a number of substances that we may not understand that are also tested on fetal cells. So things like, and again, if you're going to go against the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, you also need to go against all of these things as well for that reason. Tylenol, Pepto-Bismol, aspirin, Tums, Lipitor, Senna, Motrin, ibuprofen, Maalox, Simvastatin, Benadryl, Sudafed, albuterol, Claritin, Zoloft, Prilosec, azithromycin, and a number of other. That's not an exhaustive list. So I hope I'm not bringing that to your attention. Hopefully you understand that, because if this is an issue that you want to make a stand on, you have to realize that it's not just the mRNA vaccines. Again, to be clear, the mRNA vaccines do not have any fetal cell products in them, period, full stop. But they have been in the past tested in the development on systems that use fetal cells.
Okay, Dr. Schwelt. Now let's do this. We want to shift into our mandate section. I want to get some responses. Hold on. I know that some of you want to respond to what Dr. Schwelt just said, but I do want to shift fairly quickly to talk about the actual mandates. And a lot of our viewers are interested in hearing our thoughts on that, the thoughts of our panelists. So any quick follow-ups to what Dr. Schwelt just presented? I realize it's a lot, and quick may be a difficult thing to do.
It's not going to be quick, yeah.
But do you have anything you'd like to say, Dr. Che? I know you were.
Maybe I'll talk about it during, the next part of it.
Okay. I just want to be fair, and I recognize that there's different viewpoints represented here. Now, Dr. Schwelt, thank you for that. So let's jump into the mandate aspect. Dr. Walsh, you have been a public health officer in various, I think, county and local city governments in the past. Just give us like an idea from a philosophical medical public health standpoint, why are mandates often used? I recognize that you said you don't agree with mandates. Dr. Schwelt doesn't agree with them. Dr. Che, I'm pretty sure, doesn't agree with them. Most people here don't seem to like the mandate part very much. Why do they use these? And historically, just kind of, is this and I guess going back to the motivation aspect of things, is this population control? They're trying to kill us all. They want to mandate this is the kind of, so I'm just trying to understand why do you think a government would do this?
So what a lot of people say is that this is only deadly to 1% of people. It's probably a little higher than that. COVID itself is deadly to 1% of people. So what you have to ask yourself, you got to do a little math. How many people live in the United States and Canada? Well, it's, coming close to 400 million people. So what would 1%, if it was just 1%, what would 1% of 400 million people look like if we just said, listen, we're going to just let this thing run through the country or through North America or through the two most northern countries in North America? Well, what would happen is you would have 4 million people die based on that number. I think what you have to understand from a public health standpoint is that public health people are stepping back and saying, listen, how do we not have that happen? And that's one of the reasons why they race to a vaccine, because, to Dr. Che's point, our country, our government, our society does not understand our health message. They don't understand, general health principles, and never mind something as specific as a particular virus that is novel. And the word novel means it's new in terms of its exposure to humans. So why do they do mandates? They're doing mandates because they want to get to herd immunity. They want to try and get everyone with some antibodies as quickly as possible. And to the government that's making these mandates right now, President Biden really is pushing it. And the reasons businesses are pushing it is because of things like organizations like OSHA and the government that are kind of saying, listen, you're not creating a safe work environment unless you make sure everyone is mandated. So that's partly why you're seeing the businesses do it. but they're trying to get everyone with some antibodies so that you can end the pandemic. That really is their end goal, and that's why they're doing it. And if you understand that, you can see it's not as much, hopefully you see it's not as much a conspiracy as you think. It simply is that they are, they're putting their eggs, maybe not all their eggs, but their eggs in the basket of a vaccine to try and stop the pandemic. Now, we do know coming out very soon, Merck and some other pharmaceutical companies are coming out with pills that you can take at home that are said to be able to decrease hospitalizations and deaths. So in the next several weeks to months, especially as I think the pandemic begins to wind down, you may have people back away from vaccines so much because you might have pills that the pharmaceutical companies are saying actually can prevent the disease from getting bad in an individual.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dr. Walsh. Now, Dr. Che, the next question I was going to ask is why are vaccines so controversial in some circles? I think you've kind of given us an idea of why that is already. Do you have anything else you'd like to say in that regard? Why is it that some folks are so hesitant? And I don't know if that question even needs to be asked because it seems kind of obvious that. Right.
This is the $1 million question for why people can't get along, right? It's we just come from different places in life, and we have a hard time seeing things from other people's perspectives. So I just, this is the thing. We all need that upper room experience where we all come together and we are praying that the Lord would fulfill his promise that when we seek for him with all our hearts, that we will find truth. And I believe that this is possible for us to do. And I really appreciate you and Northern California Conference trying to do this with this panel discussion. And, I've been praying a lot for this myself, and many people have, I'm sure. So I think, I just want to touch upon this subject of why it is so controversial. For instance, we're just talking about, say, the subject of medications and health and what it is that God called his institutions to. As a conventionally trained medical doctor, I am very appreciative of my career. But as I have researched it further, there are things that I've realized that what I have learned in conventional medicine is not what God has called his people to do in the spirit of prophecy. And it's really interesting that we are talking about this subject of drugs and safety and efficacy. I think that, when we look at this vaccine, that's how we're looking at it. Is it safe? Is it effective? Despite all that, is it necessary? Is there something higher that we're going to look at to see, are those the only things that we're looking at, safety and efficacy? Or is there something else that we're going to look at to find out, is it truly necessary? And as somebody who has, been damaged by drugs, in 1998, I think it was, that trovafloxacin, Pfizer drug, it was the newest fluoroquinolone antibiotic that was put on the market, and I was put on it. And it left me with severe muscle weakness that no doctors could explain, that nobody could help me with. And I went through the 20 years with progressive weakness. I can't hang on monkey bars. I can't hold children that well without thinking that I'll drop them. And nothing that anybody could help me with. And I felt like I had the flu all the time. It was not until I was praying about this and trying to figure out what a solution might be that I found out about some of these principles of how we eat and this type of thing. And when I discovered these things, I realized something. I had been a medical missionary worker for many years. I've been teaching people about the laws of health, and I was like, they have cancer, they have autoimmune disease, and after they do the 8 laws of health, what else is there? I guess they just have standard of care medicine now, right? That's all that I knew. And I found out after working with my friend Mercy, there's so much more that you can do. And most people think that they are doing the laws of health, but when they get sick, it's like they're highly motivated. On the third day that I was at a detox program at Mercy's Place, and I woke up and I went on a walk and I realized I don't have anything. And the breathing issues that I used to have, I used to go to sleep at night and ask the Lord to please help me to breathe. I no longer had them. And I was highly motivated to do whatever it took so that I could live pain-free. So what I'm trying to tell you is that there are a lot of people who think, yeah, we've done the laws of health. It's not working. It's not helping enough for this pandemic. And so I guess all that we have left is the vaccines. And what I'm trying to say, I guess, is, I think this is an opportunity for the Seventh-day Adventist Church to dig deep and to try to find out, is there something else? Is there something else that we can do, that we can share with the world, that doesn't require people to be forced to take into their body something that they feel would violate the temple and that they feel would harm them? This vaccine has been associated with possibly causing blood clots. And I have a doctor friend who had a patient who made an appointment to see her after her first injection, and she was a 30-something-year-old mother who worked for an airline, and she was required to get vaccinated, and she got vaccinated and she developed atrial fibrillation right away. No heart problem. And so she made an appointment with my doctor, and my doctor said, well, I wouldn't recommend you get the second one. But according to these mandates, you are not excused. You don't have any medical exemptions, even if you have a reaction to the first dose. And so she said, well, I have to keep this job to take care of my kids. So she got the second vaccine. And then my doctor was notified by a friend of hers she wouldn't be seeing her because this lady died. And she had a number of stories like this, but it's not something that people talk about. I'm considered a conspiracist. I'm considered anti-intellectual. And this is anecdotal, right? Because it's not something that mainstream media is talking about. And so what I'm trying to say, I guess, is that it seems that this other side, there's always two sides for evidence, and we can choose what we want to believe. I would just ask the church to allow its members who believe that this vaccine is something that, they can't do willingly and voluntarily without violating their conscience, that they be given the ability to do that, understanding that we believe that there is something much better that God calls us to do that will protect the people even better than vaccines would. We feel that there is something that we can offer the world that is so much better than this. And it is not because we want to be selfish, but it is because we love our neighbors and we want to protect them, not only from health and safety aspects, but also from a liberty point of view, because you lose liberty in one area, and it's something very precious that you can't get back. And so we have to really teach people how to cherish these things.
So thank you, Dr. Che, for that. Let's ask this question though. How you said you want the church to give that liberty, and I want to talk about mandates here and how that relates. But is the church mandating that people get vaccinated?
Can I say, well, the church is not mandating, correct?
Okay.
And I think that the government also said it's not mandating because it's leaving it up to the businesses to do so. But at this point, the reason that we're talking about this is because we are getting mandated.
Sure.
I have two friends that have already lost their jobs. And so if they're physicians who, their religious exemption letters did not get approved and they no longer are able to work. And so, when you say the church is not mandating, yes, that is true. But if the church is saying that people who believe as I do are misleading and that we're conspiracists and that we are trying to stir a pot of trouble, which is what I read in the thing that I saw from the General Conference, then it seems that the church is allowing something to happen to its members.
Okay.
And not stepping in, not saying that they are supportive of us at all, actually the other way. And it's very surprising to someone like me.
Okay, so fair enough. The church does support the official position of the church in North America is to support vaccination in general, and then the COVID vaccine. I think there's been some positive. I haven't. I don't have the exact wording in front of me, but and we could, I think when we talk about, we're going to get to kind of what the church's response should be here in a minute. But let's just quickly, and I emphasize quickly here because we're running behind time. I want to get to just talk about the mandates and whether they're legal. First of all, a lot of people are saying this is an attack on personal liberties, religious liberty. Let's examine that at a root basis. Let's try to put aside, and I'm saying this to myself and all of our viewers. Let's just set aside our preconceived ideas for a second and try to listen to some of the, legal arguments. We're going to have people on different sides of the issue. Let's go to Nick Miller first of all. Dr. Miller, from a constitutional law standpoint, are government mandates of vaccines legal? Are they constitutional?
And the answer to that is it depends. We've already referenced the Massachusetts Jacobson case in 1905, where the court seemed to uphold state and county vaccine mandates. But that doesn't necessarily mean that all mandates are constitutional. And I certainly think after World War II and the atrocities in Germany with medical experiments, that the notion of informed consent has become broadly part of our medical system. And I don't think you would find a law upheld that required people to be physically forced to be vaccinated, right? Mm-hmm. That's pretty much off the table. What is on the table is requirements set down for conditions of entry or participation. And this is nothing new to COVID. I mean, we've had this for decades. To go to school, to go to La Sierra. We do have vaccine mandates at our colleges. Most of them aren't COVID mandates. They're to do with other sorts of vaccines. And I did check the Walla Walla website, and it does look like as of the end of November that they will be requiring vaccination there, though they do have medical and religious exemptions you can apply for. So it's not a full mandate or requirement. Exemptions are allowed. The president has set down a requirement that is now rules are being made by OSHA that businesses less than 100, more than 100 employees are going to need to be vaccinated or test weekly. Now, that's rather a daring move on his part. If this had been passed by Congress, there really would be probably not much question about its constitutionality. I suppose even there it would be examined, but there's some question as to whether the president can unilaterally order this. Mm-hmm. What may save it is the fact that, or in the alternative, and I think that our friends on the right who are very opposed to vaccine requirements shouldn't overstate this, because the law as stated says vaccinated or weekly testing. And that would certainly allow, there's a law, Title VII, which is those of us who are attorneys here who work for the church, very familiar, require accommodation of religious convictions. And the church, while not willing to write on its own letterhead, because we don't believe this is a religious liberty issue, but we are willing to support our members who feel otherwise and have private consciences they wish to protect. And I personally drafted a form letter that will come from the member, but is written in a way so that it's legally defensible. And it points out that the member should be accommodated whether or not their church supports them. Right. And we are willing to assist our members in making those individual claims. And the question becomes, how much of a threat do you represent in your job? As an attorney, I'm actually representing some individuals. You may have heard of United Airlines case. It was in the media recently. And there they were just requiring vaccination, and their only accommodation was leave without pay for everybody. Well, I don't think that's a fair accommodation, right? Mm-hmm. If you're a baggage handler, if you're someone who's not near any passengers and you can be masked and you can be tested, There's lots of employees that could be kept safe without requiring. And what about those who've had the COVID and have antigens that make them as defensible? But having said that, I find it very difficult for like frontline healthcare workers. Honestly, Title VII doesn't give you an absolute right to be exempt from it. If you are going to be a threat to others, then hospitals are going to be able to say it is an undue hardship to accommodate you. And honestly and frankly, as an Adventist attorney who cares about the Constitution and religious liberty, there's not a meaningful religious liberty claim against that. You will probably lose under the Constitution. And honestly, as a moral matter, you probably should, because you don't have a right to threaten the health and safety of other people. Religious liberty is about your conscience and worshiping God, not about invading, as A.T. Jones said to Congress, as Dr. Schweltz shared with us. So that's kind of an overview.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Miller. And of course there is debate over whether, and I don't really think we have time to get into this, whether the vaccines prevent disease more than like if you've had COVID before and have antibodies. So maybe there is some wiggle room there when it comes to, that. But it does seem from the data, if you believe the data, and this is where I think a lot of people struggle, that vaccination does make you safer as a member of society, both for your own sake as well as keeping you from spreading it to other people. Jonathan, I want to go to you. Jonathan Cherney, what about private companies? So the government, Nicholas Miller just talked about what the government can do. What about private companies? Does the private business owner, we're a capitalist society. We like to let businesses do what they want to do. Let's just say that they decide, hey, I want all my employees to be vaccinated. I'm going to mandate that for my employees, not because the government's doing it, just because I want to. Do they have the right to do that? And you're muted, Jonathan, so you might want to unmute there.
There we go. Thank you. I think it's the same answer as with the government. It depends. With the government context, I don't think Jacobson's good law, it was before the standards of review on constitutionality. It was also just specifically rejected by the current court in the Roman Catholic Diocese case versus the governor of New York. But that doesn't mean that something wouldn't be held to be constitutional. It would have to, be analyzed under the new, standards of review, strict scrutiny, or whatever the court's going to analyze it under. But yeah, for private companies, it also depends. Typically, yes, a company can mandate that you be vaccinated. They can mandate that you work on Sabbath. They could mandate, probably that you have to be a smoker to work here, or anything else. But the thing that a company can't do is mandate that you do something that you're not doing for a protected reason. If you're not doing it because of your religion or because of your race or your gender or, any of those other protected categories, then they have a duty to accommodate you unless they could prove that it would cause an undue hardship on the business. And so, that's why I say it depends. It depends on why you are not getting vaccinated as to whether or not they can mandate it. And it depends on whether they can show that it would be an undue hardship on the business. I think it's going to be pretty hard for businesses to show that, given that there are lots of other businesses that are allowing accommodations. The government's allowing, people to do testing or wear masks or do these other things instead of get vaccinated. And there's also evidence that even the vaccinated people, from what I've seen, can still spread COVID. And so, I think it's going to be hard for them to find undue hardship. And that's kind of why I think people, employers are, who favor the mandate are attacking people as to the requirement that it be a sincerely held religious belief. And so we're seeing a lot of questions where people are being questioned, they're being interrogated by the company lawyers about what your belief is, and have you taken other vaccines? And so we're seeing people being attacked on that front, and sometimes it's outright harassment. I have one person that I've spoken to give help to that they were told that you are I hope you die from COVID. This is one lady that I'm helping get a religious exemption, and
That's
she was
nice.
told, I hope you die from COVID. I'm like, and someone else is saying you're the reason for this pandemic because you won't get vaccinated, as if the vaccines were around before the pandemic. But so you see a lot of people being attacked and harassed based on
Sure.
whether their belief is sincere. And so to go back to the question, it really depends on why you aren't getting vaccinated, whether it's for a protected reason or not.
Well, and that's good. And and just on the other side of that coin, and I'd like both you and Nick Miller to just touch on this very briefly, if you want, is the employer liability for not vaccinating their employees. There have been some cases, one here in California, where a lady who worked for See's Candy got COVID at work because they weren't mandating masking or anything like that. Took it home to her husband. He died. She sued. And they're trying to, of course, usually workplace injuries are covered under workers' compensation, but they were able to get this and try it as a civil case and get damages. Of course, it's going up on appeal. I'm not sure what the last, but I guess the question is, what about the rights of those who don't want to get COVID? As opposed to the rights of religious people who don't want to get the vaccine. I think there's a balancing there, right? And I think that the courts are also going to be looking at cases where employers are going to be liable for not having safety practices in place. Any thoughts on that from either of you?
Yeah, I think that remains to be seen. If they're not requiring any other protected measures for people who aren't getting vaccinated, then maybe they could be found negligent or grossly negligent, and there could be some liability there. But I mean, you also got to remember, it's how can you trace it back to you getting COVID from someone that's unvaccinated, unless you're living in a hole and then only coming out to go to work to be next to this one person that's unvaccinated. I mean, I think you have a causal problem that you're going to be facing. And plus, there's studies out that I've seen. I'm not a medical expert, so I don't really know, but I would definitely find one if I was defending this case. Is that people who are vaccinated can also spread COVID. And so I think it's going to be hard for an employer to be found liable because they have unvaccinated individuals there at the end of the day. But hey, I've been surprised before by court decisions, so I wouldn't put my money on anything.
So trace testing is pretty effective. I mean, they run back and they can frequently find out who's infected you. And I think as far as our institutions and businesses are concerned, you do need to be, the standard of care is going to be set by, what the departments of health and the state guidelines are. And if you're going below those or beneath those, and it can be shown that somebody got sick at your workplace, then yes, I think you are open to liability. I would be concerned about that.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to try to get this wrapped up here in a few minutes, famous last words. But Jonathan, let's go back to you. I want to ask you a question. This is kind of getting into the whole mandate. What is, in your view, the religious basis for seeking an exemption from a vaccine mandate for the COVID vaccine? What would you, how would you frame that?
I would say if you were my client and you came to me and asked that, I'd tell you, you probably don't have a basis. If you don't know what your religious reason is, it's probably a pretty good indicator you don't have a religious basis. The fact is, it doesn't really matter what your religious belief is. What matters under the law is that it's sincerely held. So, I mean, you could believe, I can tell you some of the things I've heard, just from talking and counseling people. Some people believe it's, the Daniel chapter 1 test, Daniel's diet. Some people I've talked to think it is the mark of the beast. Some people think it's, the pharmakia of Revelation 18 that it talks about, or, other people say this is just a sin against my body, which is God's temple, or, of course, it has aborted fetal tissues. We've heard that one. And so, these are the different things that people are claiming, but, it doesn't really matter. What matters is your belief sincerely held? And if it is, the law says that you get favored treatment. You're not treated as equals, but you get favored treatment. And even the Supreme Court recognized in Thomas versus Revenue Board, they said that, an individual's religious beliefs, they need not be acceptable, they need not be logical, they need not be consistent or comprehensible to others to warrant protection. And so maybe it isn't acceptable in society to be unvaccinated. Maybe your belief that the COVID vaccines violate your temple is illogical, because other people believe you're protecting your temple by taking the vaccine, or maybe, it's inconsistent. You've taken other vaccines in the past, but you won't take this vaccine. The Supreme Court says that doesn't matter. If your belief is sincerely held, we will still protect you and you can still participate in society. And so, I personally think, it's important that we protect minority religious views, because when we stop protecting the unacceptable, when we stop protecting the illogical or the inconsistent religious beliefs, we face the problem of who decides what is acceptable, who decides what is illogical. Is it the courts? Is it the majority? And so you can quickly see how this could lead to coercion or persecution. And so that's why we as Christians, cannot support vaccine mandates that don't allow a religious exemption. And I think it's our duty as Christians, to support, religious freedom, even if we find it is unacceptable to us or illogical to us. And so, from a legal standpoint, it doesn't really matter what your religious belief is. The law protects you regardless of how logical or illogical it is, as long as it is sincerely held.
I wanted to jump in as someone who's actually gone through a religious liberty case. So on the other side of what these attorneys are talking about, I've actually been the one defended by an incredible religious attorney firm in First Liberty out of Dallas, Texas, when I was in Pasadena and then later on in Georgia. And I want to say one of the things, when I looked at this, the claim about mandates and religious liberty, to me, it was very different than what I experienced. But I do agree with what was just said by what the attorney just said. I think one of the reasons I'm not, I would have to lean against mandates myself is because I do think that, you have to make space for the illogical. You have to make space for that which does not make sense in a way, because when one day we will be the ones who do not make sense. And so, that is where the rubber kind of meets the road, and why I think it's something to be very careful of. Now, I honestly think, in my opinion, this has expanded religious rights, because in my healthcare system, the largest in our state, pretty much anyone who asked for a religious exemption got one. The state of New York upheld, the mandates had been paused at least because there was not a religious exemption component to it. Almost everyone I know across the country who's asked for a religious exemption has got one. I know not everybody did, and I'm sure everybody can say they know somebody who didn't. And I think because there is no organized religion, or very few, and they're very small, that literally says you cannot get vaccinated, it is against our religion, yet people get religious exemptions, I think it's a statement that that this is not what a lot of people think it is. I do not think this is the mark of the beast junior. I think that this really is a test, and not in the way most people think. I think this is a test around, as Americans, how do we respond to a crisis? This country forces people to do a lot of things. Pay taxes, which is not pleasant. Draft people into military service, also not pleasant. Wear seatbelts. A lot of people hate doing that, or not being able to smoke in certain places. There's a lot of things we're forced to not be able to do. The fact that we can get religious exemptions, and both attorneys, Nicholas and Jonathan, both have stated, Nicholas, I think, mentioned that he's actually helped draft these things for people. I didn't draft anything, any of my workers, but I was supportive if they didn't want to get the vaccine and wanted to get an exemption, as long as they were willing to do all the other things, which is test weekly, wear masks, and do all the other protective things. I think this is why what is happening, I'll say this and then I'm pretty much done. This is why this is so dangerous to our church, because we have to step back. Dr. Joyce mentioned the upper room experience earlier, and I applaud that statement. Our church is heading towards true trial. And these little tests, if they cause us to become splintered and break apart so easily and quickly, it tells you as a people, we won't survive what is coming, because this is not like what's coming. There will be no out. There will be no exemption letters. When the time of trouble comes, as described in the Great Controversy, you will be stuck. And the only way to do it, the only way out of it will be to give up your moral conviction. In this case, most people don't have to. Even if you lose your job and have to go find another one, that's a very different thing than never being able to buy or sell ever again. And I think we have to keep that in mind, so we keep things in perspective, and so that we keep a spirit of love and not one of hate. I'm okay with people who don't want to get the vaccine, even though I'm okay with the vaccine. I have no problem with it. I think the bigger danger is that over an issue like this, people will name call and call people snakes, and So I think, I don't know if Dr. Joyce was saying that she was name called. I was on it. I didn't even want to be on one of these things, and I was on when people started calling me all kinds of names because I said I got vaccinated, and I'm like, I also stand in front of people with COVID every day. So me getting vaccinated is probably very different than you getting vaccinated. But this is the danger, and I think we have to stop and move away from the argument itself and remember we have a common adversary. And our common adversary is not the United States government. It's not pharmaceutical companies. It's Satan himself. And he's brilliant at dividing God's people so that we are so enmeshed in argument that we cannot finish this work and go home. So please, my final words on this, I think we're way over time, is that we have got to enter into this discourse with love and understanding, hear each other out, and be convinced that at the end of the day, we need to have the character of Christ. The big disease we've got to escape is sin, and we need the character of Christ. And what I've seen in this dialogue back and forth is a lack of such character, and that's more frightening to me than the vaccine or the virus.
And you're not talking about our dialogue here in this panel.
No. Overall.
Yeah.
Okay.
But certainly in the comment section.
In the comment section, it's been pretty nasty.
I've never been called a demon before. This is the first for me.
Yeah.
And
they're gonna
Jesuits
use their Second Amendment rights on us, they said. Dr. Swell, you had your hand, or Dr. Swell, and then I think Dr. Miller.
Yeah, the thing that concerns me the most as well is this false bundling of political and philosophical ideas, like I was talking about at the beginning, and that is, the vax people are being called sheeple, the vax hesitants are being called conspiracy theorists, the vaccine people are over trusting authority, the vax hesitants are distrusting of authority, and what I'm starting to see more and more of, and this is my major concern, is that we're seeing distrust of authority on airplanes. We're seeing distrust of authority on social media. We're seeing distrust of the police, defunding the police, what's going on in Portland. We're seeing it all over the country. And I have to admit that when we see these mandates coming out, they are becoming more draconian. Someone brought up a very good point about the fact that we are not taking into consideration natural immunity, even though there is science there that may determine that it is beneficial. And I think they bring up a very valid point. And what I am concerned about is that the overbearance on the side of vaccine mandates is causing a reaction in the church that is, I'm already starting to see it. I'm already starting to see Seventh-day Adventist pastors preaching from Seventh-day Adventist pulpits, and they're talking about Matthew 24 and false Christs being potentially authorities in political power, in medical power, in spiritual power. And so there's this thing that is creeping through the church of this distrust of authority. And let me remind you from the spirit of prophecy, if you don't mind, because I think this is really the key point here for me, and then I'll be done. And that is, if I could just share the screen of these quotes. This is the spirit of prophecy that we're talking about here. We already know, if we can bring that up, Ellen White already tells us exactly what we're going to be accused of. I mean, if you knew that you were going to court and this was going to be the accusation, we would make sure in a time of Facebook and social media where everything we write down is kept and saved, that these sorts of things are going to be brought up when we are brought to trial. Listen to what she says. Those who honor the biblical Sabbath will be denounced as enemies of law and order, as breaking down the moral restraints of society, causing anarchy and corruption and calling down the judgments of God upon the earth. She goes on to say, a false coloring will be given to their words, and the worst construction will be put upon their motives. You know, it's interesting to me that when the 1905 came out, that decision, and Clifford Goldstein writes about the 7-2 ruling, it's interesting to me that she said absolutely nothing about it. So we always say, what did she say? She said very little. She said nothing. She wrote nothing down. And I think the reason for that is because of what she writes here in letter 4, 1898. She says, whatever your opinions you may entertain in regarding to casting your vote in political questions. And make no mistake about it, this vaccine COVID-19 mandate issue is a political issue. She says, our people need to be silent upon questions which have no relation to the third angel's message. If ever a people needed to draw nigh to God, it is Seventh-day Adventists. There have been wonderful devices and plans made. I think about this binding up, this false binding of anarchy somehow goes along with you're vax hesitant, but yet people who were vax hesitant a year ago are being tempted, it seems. Some of the people, not everybody, certainly not anybody I'm saying anyone on this broadcast, but I am starting to hear already in the Seventh-day Adventist Church how the government, how all of these people need to be, done away with. They're writing against it. She says, if Seventh-day Adventists, there have been wonderful devices and plans made. A burning desire has taken hold of men or women to proclaim something or to bind up with something. They do not know what. And here it is. Here's the punchline. But the silence of Christ upon many subjects was true eloquence. She says, it is our duty in every case to obey the laws of our land unless they conflict with the higher law which God spoke with an audible voice from Sinai and afterward engraved on stone with his own finger. Our work is not to make a raid on the government, but to prepare a people to stand in that great day of the Lord. The fewer attacks we make on authorities and powers, the more we will be able to do for God. Let's not forget that we are not regular citizens of this country. I talked to an ambassador to Malta, and you know what she told me? She was a Seventh-day Adventist. She says the first rule that she was told is when you go to a country, you do not get involved in local politics. If you do, your credentials will be yanked immediately and you'll be pulled back. And the reason for that was that you will eliminate half the population that you are able to promote the policy of the United States. The other thing that she said is that when she was about to go out, they spun the globe around. They said, okay, point to your country. Where is it? And she pointed to Malta. Okay. And her superior said, no, you are wrong. That is not your country. Your country is here, the United States of America. Do you not know that we are not citizens of this world? We are ambassadors from heaven. God is not here to set up his earthly kingdom. He is here to set up a heavenly kingdom. And the moment we get involved in the politics of this earth, we have now eliminated people from our reach and our ability to spread the word and to do what we have been given as a task, which is to spread the three angels' messages. So I do not think it is a mistake or it is an oversight that Ellen White did not write about vaccines. I believe that we should take her example. It is not a moral issue. People who take the vaccine are not going to be now more susceptible to going against true conscience down the road. People who don't refuse the vaccine, or people who do refuse the vaccine, are not morally inferior. If they lose their job, and I pray that they don't, I pray for them every day. But if they do, and it is God's will, then God will sustain them. And hopefully they will be able, it says, Ellen White says at the end of time, that many physicians and nurses not in their roles will be able to do a great work in the end time. So I really want to affirm what Joyce has said. It is least of my will that people should be harmed from this vaccine. But in the position that I'm in, where I'm in the hospital and I see many people dying and all of them are without the vaccine, if I didn't speak up and say something, it would be because I have nothing of worthwhile in me. It is something that I need to say. It is something that we all need to say. And I think hopefully from here, as the title of this says, we can go forward.
Thank you, Dr. Swell. All right, listen, I want to wrap this up in 1 minute. Dr. Che, Dr. Miller, Pastor Woodson, 30 seconds each. That's 90 seconds. Let's do this. Dr. Che, you have any closing thoughts?
Oh boy. Well, okay. I think one thing is here. I hope that what people take away from this is that the way that you have been brought up to believe that the world should be may not necessarily be. And, you know, we are supposed to see the three angels message go forward with power and with true medical missionary work to accompany it. It hasn't happened yet. I think that we have an awesome opportunity right now. And so I look at this, you know, the spirit of prophecy says that God means that truth shall be brought to the front and become the subject of examination and discussion, even through the contempt placed upon it. The minds of the people must be agitated. Every controversy, every reproach, every effort to restrict liberty of conscience is God's means of awakening minds that otherwise might slumber. And so I want to just encourage people who are scared, people who might be facing losing their jobs, to keep your eyes fixed upon Jesus. And, you know, don't be afraid at this time. God has a way for each one of us. And it doesn't matter necessarily, you know, what it is that you see other people doing. Keep your eyes fixed upon Jesus and move forward.
Good thoughts. Dr. Miller.
So I'll second what Dr. Schwelt has said. But some may respond to him by saying, well, the church in supporting the vaccine has kind of taken a political position, hasn't it? And, you know, I think that, to be fair, we can't just say it's a political matter and we should all stay out of it when the church has supported it. But I will say this, that the church, none of the formal bodies of the church have supported vaccine mandates. We don't promote them. We haven't sought them. Some of our institutions have to respond to them. They have to obey them. But I just feel like, responding to what Dr. Che and Dr. Walsh have said about the upper room experience, you know, I'm not going to take time to read all of Ephesians 4:11 to 14, but it's just becoming clearer and clearer to me that the pursuit of truth isn't just an individual affair. It's a community affair. Who do you trust? Who do you have confidence in? And we're told in verse 14 that there's a system been put in place to save us from every wind of teaching and the cunning and craftiness of people in their deceitful scheming, right? What is that system that protects us from deceitful scheming? And you might say conspiracy theories and lies and misleading stories. Well, if you read the two verses before, it's the system of pastors and evangelists and prophets and teachers, and I might add medical doctors and church lawyers and the full body of Christ coming together and listening to each other and supporting each other. And my fundamental question for Christians who are opposing the vaccine and saying it's dangerous and evil, if it was the government that was promoting it, and our leaders like Dr. Schwelt and Dr. Walsh and our NAD and GC leaders.
I think we lost Dr. Miller there. Are you still there, Dr. Miller? You muted yourself. You are muted.
Can you hear me now?
Now we can hear you. Yep.
Okay. I would say that there would be lots of reasons to be very concerned about that vaccine. But as a Christian, I'm a member of my church community and a member of my civil community. And when the leaders of my church community and my civil community and my church community leaders aren't invested in big pharma, they have my similar spiritual commitments to last day events, to the spirit of prophecy, and to the Bible. They're honest scientists and honest people who have my spiritual and physical health in their best of intentions. Why am I disbelieving them? Why am I believing anonymous voices on the internet who are sending me emails and writing me videos that don't know me, that don't believe the same spiritual things I believe? We are denying the unity of the body of Christ when we are going against the spokespersons that the Lord has put into positions by training, by experience, by expertise, and by spiritual recognition of the body of Christ. This truly becomes a test of who we believe and how we relate to the body of Christ. And my prayer is that we can come together into greater unity of spirit and recognize that we're not denying exemptions, are we? You've heard me talk about them. You've heard Dr. Walsh and Swelt talk about them. Can't we come together on some of the things we agree with and seek a greater unity in the spirit? That's my closing appeal.
Good thoughts. Dr. Woodson, I'm going to leave the final word with you. And I want to thank all the panelists for being here. Thank you for your time, your thoughts. This has gone longer than we expected, of course, but it's been a good discussion. And Dr. Woodson, why don't you give us your closing thoughts, and then we'll close with prayer.
Well, first, I want to thank you on behalf of the Northern California Conference for having this discussion and all of these great guests and the perspectives. And I tell you, I didn't come in with a closed mind. I tried to have an open mind, and I think hey, there's some things that I heard today that will make me think a bit differently. But I think what I've heard, and I've heard some good sermons today. So I think I'm the only pastor on here, but I've heard some good sermons. I will just kind of echo what I've heard just recently, and that is just this sense that we must be the body of Christ, and we must work together in unity. I think there are three principles that are going to help us as we go forward. Number one is what I start out with, and that is love God with all of our heart and love people. We've got to ask God for wisdom on how to do those things. The second one is, and it's a concern I have for our people and our church, is we are a people that uphold truth. And so anything that we can't verify to be truth, we should not promulgate it. We should not use whatever we think is conspiracy theory, or if it's some unsubstantiated source, we should not spread that because that is going to backfire on people like us who believe in the truth. When we start moving away from objective truth, how are we going to teach that the seventh day is the Sabbath? How are we going to teach that what we read in the scriptures is true if we're making up all kinds of fantasies? It's going to hurt us. It's going to hurt us. And we've got to be careful. I think I heard it earlier about this doing away with any authority. If it came from this person, then it's wrong. If it's come from the government, it's wrong. If it comes from these science folk, it's wrong. We have got to be a people of truth. The last thing I would say is a principle for us as we talk about being unified. We must think about what freedom truly is. There are times when, as a follower of Jesus, that I allow certain things to happen because I know the freedom is going to be a greater blessing. Giving up some things that I say, well, that's not a big deal one way or the other. It's going to be a blessing. So this idea, the Christian ethic of freedom, sometimes limits my freedom for the common good. And I think that is the spirit of Christ. So I definitely want to keep praying as well. A lot of our churches are divided on this issue. We shouldn't be. Let us focus in on what our mission is. Let us focus on what's most important. People are dying, besides from COVID, they're dying from a lot of things, and they're going to Christless graves. That's on us as a people of God to share this message. We can't afford to be fighting each other over these kinds of things. We just can't. So Amen. I'm really grateful for this discussion and for these experts.
Let's pray. Thank you, Dr. Woodson. Father in heaven, this has been a long but good discussion. There's so much more we could talk about, so much more we could cover. I wish we could get to some of the questions and the comments. We invite your Holy Spirit into our hearts and pray that he would guide not just us, but your church in these difficult times. We want your wisdom, and we want to follow you wherever you lead us. And we pray that your church could be who you made us to be in this world during this day and age. Lord, people are needing to know about much more than vaccines right now. They need to know about your truth for eternal life. And so we pray that we could not get distracted, but at the same time, we have to address these issues. Thank you for this group of people who've been here today. Bless each one of them in their individual lives and their ministries. In Jesus' name, amen. Once again, thank you. And thanks to all our viewers. We will maybe take up the conversation again sometime, but God bless you all.